That's yours if you want it back.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Welcome to another special meeting, I should say, of the Joint Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivisions Committee. We've convened today to discuss one topic in particular, and that's electricity, and particularly electricity rates. And we've got a pretty aggressive agenda in front of us. We do have us working through the morning. However, we do have quite a few bills to work through, so it's possible that we will work into the afternoon. Just to give everyone a roadmap, I'm going to stick to the agenda. The agenda is going to have an update from Rocky Mountain Power and public comment, and then we're going to take each bill one by one. So even if you're tempted in public comment on Rocky Mountain Power to talk about the bills, please don't. We'll go through them, we'll get through them in time, but I want to take them one at a time. And with that, let's call the roll.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. This is roll call for September 20th, 2023. Senator Barlow. Senator Boner.
Here. He's online.
Senator Landon.
Here.
Senator Scott.
Here.
Representative Chadwick.
Here.
Representative Harrelson.
Here.
Representative Harshman.
Here.
Representative Knapp.
Here.
Representative Newsom. Here. Representative Ottman.
Here.
Representative Wiley.
Here.
Representative Yin.
Excuse me.
Sorry, excused.
Co-Chairman Case.
Present.
Co-Chairman Olson.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Excellent, thank you. All right, we will take up our first topic, an update on Rocky Mountain Power rate cases, but first I believe Chairman Case, you have something that you want to show the committee and present to them.
Yes, if we could, Mr. Chairman, I thought it might be useful to talk about how a rate case works and put up the formula that's used really universally across the United States and elsewhere in the world about how rate cases work. So if Katie can find it, she's going to put it up. And almost everything that we're going to be talking about today relates to this formula and how rates are derived. It looks like a lot of mumbo jumbo, but regulated utilities, they're governed by the public service commissions. They're a special entity. They've been given the right to serve an area, frequently a very exclusive right to serve in return for the ability to have regulated rates that they collect from their customers. Almost every jurisdiction has a public service commission or an equivalent that will provide for these rates. There's a very, very long history, well over 100 years of how we got here. And rate making started out in kind of in the courts, and it moved to legislators became very involved, and it ended up being in this developing public service commissions. Illinois was one of the first ones. Other states in the Midwest followed shortly after. And it comes down to this formula, which everybody kind of agrees to follow and provide some structure. So the important thing is, what are the annual revenues that a utility is entitled to? And it's based on this formula where the revenue requirements, that's the annual revenues, is equal to the amount of money that the amount of investment that the utility has. And so that is what we call the valuation. And it's just the cost of all the assets that are devoted to the public utility enterprise. Those assets are reduced by the amount of the accumulated depreciation. That's the D in the formula. And so that is, if you have a very old plant and it's been depreciated without any new investment in that plant, then it may have a small value in the rate base. That's called the rate base. On the other hand, most plants receive ongoing investments, capital investments. It's often in terms of pollution controls or other matters. So even though a plant may be old, they have very long lives and they may have been updated. So it's not necessary that they have a very low value in the revenue requirement, the valuation. So we have V minus D, or valuation minus all the depreciation. That's your net rate base that the utility is entitled to receive a chance to earn a return on. And that is, that's pretty well established. You cannot say they don't get that opportunity to earn a return. They'll lose in court. It's a constitutional violation. It's confiscation. So R is the rate of return. It's just, that X doesn't mean anything, but it's a multiplication sign. So the rate of return is how much the company needs to basically be a vigorous and a healthy company providing these services. So it's a combination based on the company's capital structure, because all companies have either debt or equity, combination of the two. And the rate of return is the amount of return on that investment that provides compensation for both the debt holders and the equity holders. That's a kind of a complicated determination. And you look at utilities in different ways and think that they, traditionally in the old days, they were very secure investments. They had this guaranteed monopoly. They didn't have regulatory risk. And so the rate of return was often lower than you might get in a more competitive industry. E is the annual expenses. They also get reimbursement for their annual expenses. And that would be, salaries are in there, all sorts of different things, cost of fuel, those kind of issues are in the big E. And then another expense, but we write it separately typically, is this little D, and that's just the annual depreciation rate. That's usually set over time. It's kind of a straight line, divide the asset by its long life, and that's what you come up with. But there are other types of depreciation too. Might be accelerated depreciation. There might be reasons that you change the depreciation schedule based on assets becoming not relevant in the market anymore, or things like that. So when you look at the annual depreciation, you were to sum the depreciation for all the years, that's how you get the big D that we talked about earlier. Now, if we could have the next slide, Katie, I'd really appreciate it. Yeah, sure. I'm sorry. Go back.
Representative Newsom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the rate piece, or the rate of return, who determines that? The utility or the PSC or some combination, or?
Senator Case.
So the Public Utility Commission, or the PSC, is a quasi-judicial entity, and they hold hearings and there are presentations made on both sides. So that will be a contested issue in the Rocky Mountain Power case, as will other things like expenses and the valuation. So they come in and people will make arguments on both sides. It might go something like this: well, you're a regulated utility, you don't deserve the return that the marketplace has. Debt is cheaper. You don't have enough debt, so we're going to weight it towards the debt because that's cheaper than equity. And somebody will come back and say, I'm an expert and I say this. And then the other side will kind of take a different tact at it. Nothing's black and white. Both sides don't come to the same number. Then the PSC in the end will have to determine who's right.
Chairman.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, following up on that, is the rate of return set on a company by company basis, or is it, you have the same rate of return for similar companies and other companies in similar business?
Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Each company is different. They have unique circumstances. They have a unique capital structure. They serve unique territories. They have different businesses. So it's a uniquely determined thing for each company.
Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Senator Case, I've visited with a lot of constituents over the last month or so, and there are some misconceptions out there. I'd be curious, I don't have the depth of knowledge that someone like you does, but what is the most misunderstood, perhaps, issue or two that we're talking about here this morning? One of the ones I've run into is that people don't understand that a company like Rocky Mountain Power is not going to get anything they ask for, just carte blanche. It is regulated, and that's kind of a hard thing for people to get their arms around. So,
Senator Case?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Landon, with your permission, could we do the next slide and then come back to your question? It's a good question, and we'll come back, I promise. So in terms of this calculation with this formula, you guys, it's typically a one-time thing. We have a rate case. It's based on something called the test year, which is all the data for that year. It's the amount of the revenue requirement is set, and people leave after the commission order, and they hold to those rates as time goes by. That can be very advantageous to the utility or not. It kind of depends on whether, if you have a rate case every 10 years or 5 years, things change in between. Typically, the utility has an incentive to try to do a better job of managing its business to maybe shave some of those expenses and come under the same revenue requirements so they can do a little bit better. But on the other hand, they're also fighting inflation, and they don't want to come in for rate cases. I assure you it's a last resort because it is such an onerous process. And so inflation takes a toll. Things go up in price, salaries go up, everything goes up. So this one-time revenue requirement, it's kind of stressed the minute it's out the door. Some basic principles about the things are, for example, valuation. I think the most basic one to that is that the assets used by the utility have to be used and useful. There has to be a finding that they are actually a benefit to Wyoming ratepayers. The thing about the valuation piece is it's the long-term piece. Expenses come and go, and we're going to talk more about some automatic adjustments to expenses, but the valuation piece is there for decades, and that will affect rates for decades to come. The rate of return, another contentious thing, it's got to be comparable to other market opportunities, similar in risk for the investor, and it's weighted between the cost of equity and the cost of debt. I think we talked about that a little bit before, but it's an important consideration. And I think this gets a little bit to your question, Senator Landon, because a lot of people think we just have the ability to say no to Rocky Mountain Power, and that, throw them out, keep the rates where they are. We don't have that ability, because the company's entitled to earn a return on the assets that it devotes, the assets and expenses, but a return on the assets that it devotes to public utility service. Their investors have put it up it's called the regulatory compact in a lot of ways. And, our citizens that think we can just say no, get packing, would be in error. It's also very unhealthy to underfund utilities over time. And I work overseas. I see this all the time, where the US aid programs will build a utility system, electric or water or whatever, and they will walk away from it. And then it's managed by the local people in these in different countries, but yet there's no more investment. There's no more attraction. They're starved for capital, and they're starved to pay their expenses over time. System falls apart over time. They don't maintain that. They cannot maintain that high level of service. So getting that right, Senator Landon and Mr. Chairman, is important. And we have to realize this is policies that are going to go for a long time and affect whether we have a healthy functioning utility or not. So to think that we can just say no is a great error. Senator Scott, I'm sorry, I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, on this rate of return, can we get from either Rocky Mountain or,
Mike, Senator Scott.
can we get from either Rocky Mountain or the Public Service Commission, how in the past 20 years, the rate of return for Rocky Mountain has varied, and have that charted with some kind of a standard measure of inflation or a standard measure of interest rates so that we can see how it varies, how those things vary together. Mr. Chairman, I think Senator Case is exactly right that this is a key measure here. And if each company will have an actual cost of capital, which will vary quite a bit. If your rate of return is higher than your actual cost of capital, you're incentivized to get rid of old assets and replace them with new ones. So you have a higher valuation that you get in your income on. If the opposite is true, you have an incentive to skimp, not make needed investments that are needed, not make investments that are needed and get in trouble. And I think we need to see, trying to understand this, Mr. Chairman, how those things have varied over time and how sensitive the adjustments are.
Co-Chairman Case.
Mr. Chairman, I think we mentioned at the last meeting, the notion that a utility might, or the theory or the practice of whether a utility would overinvest in order to maximize those revenues is kind of, it's had its ups and downs in economic theory, and it's been tested, but it's certainly, it's called the Average-Johnson effect, actually, Average-Johnson-Welch, but it has been found in some cases, but I wouldn't call it a systematic finding of bias within the utility. And it's probably because other factors keep it in check, like worries about competition, changes in the industry, having the wrong investment as you go forward. But it's certainly a possibility. And Senator Scott has put his finger on something that has occupied a lot of time in discussions about this. I'll try to finish up if that's all right. Finishing up on the expenses, the basic requirement for expenses is that they be prudent. They be related to providing public utility service, that expenses that may be, for example, if the company makes charitable contributions, the ratepayers, should they be paying for that or should they not? I'm going to have some questions about that with respect to a utility program called the Blue Sky program. But this is the way the formula works. It's largely static, but in recent decades, things have become a little bit more fluid as utilities have sought and been permitted to have automatic adjustment clauses with respect to some expenses. And it's just easier in the end for everybody for there to be a automatic adjustment clause for known things that change rather than have them have to come back in and go through a rate case. So oftentimes automatic adjustment clauses apply to fuel, and that, for example, that's one item that would reflect significant changes in costs. We could, whether that's in the formula or in addition to the formula, it's kind of up to you. You could write it either way. But the automatic adjustment clauses aren't held in terms of the one-time revenue requirement. All the issues in the Rocky Mountain case are pretty much in that formula. Valuation, for example, the assets, Rocky Mountain Power serves many states. And the assets are all divided up between the states. Some of the assets, those are called system assets. There are also assets that are particular to states. Those are called situs. And that division is an issue, may or not be an issue in this case, but it's an issue in the big picture. Also, whether, an asset is installed for the benefit of Wyoming ratepayers. I think that's an issue in this case. For example, transmission. Within the expense area, big pieces in this case, in the east side, we've had this fuel adjustment clauses and the proposal of how we share it between the company and the ratepayers. But all the expenses get trued up over time. So even though it might be out of sync for a while, it all comes back together. It's not the same as the valuation being out of whack, and that's something that's out there for decades. So if there's a sharing mechanism for fuel changes, it used to be 70-30. The company would like to change that, where the company, I can't remember, I think it's the ratepayers have the 70%, the company has the 30%. They want to change that ratio. But it's not as important in the big picture over time because it does get trued up. But that's an issue. Fuel costs represent about 1/3 of the rates they're asking for. And there are actually two cases. There's the rate case itself, and then there's the cost of fuel adjustment case. So that it's about 1/3 for just fuel. And that's where you've heard a lot in the newspapers about coal being more expensive and natural gas being more expensive. Risk in the cost of capital is definitely a big issue. Another expense, we'll go back to expense for a second, there's something called the net power costs. And that's a big one in this case. And net power costs is the cost that the utility incurs to purchase power to serve load from other parties. They don't generate it themselves. They, as the system has changed over time, the components, arguably, they are buying more power on the open market. And there may be under contracts, or it may be more on the spot purchases, but it's different than the old traditional utility business. So they're buying, who knows what the source of the power would be. It could be natural gas fired, for example, and it could go back to gas being expensive. But we didn't used to have to do that. We do that now because the assets we rely on, increasingly, the renewable assets are intermittent, which makes you have to buy more power elsewhere. And that's probably, you could say, well, they shouldn't have to buy power elsewhere. They should have those plants ready and going. There's elements of that too. But maintaining a plant in readiness is pretty expensive when you only use it very infrequently. And I think it's good that Rocky Mountain Power will be able to address all these things kind of in their presentation. And I hope that this is helpful, but we're all restricted by this formula. And although it looks mathematical and it looks like, we could deviate from it, the truth is the courts have forced us into this formula. And the components, and there are court cases on every piece of this, including the used and useful piece, the prudency piece, the can't confiscate by having rates too low piece. So we're bound by that. And anyway, I hope that was a fair stage setting for our discussions, and maybe we could refer back to this formula to understand what's going on as we go forward. And as you all know, I'm a participant in the case, and I appreciate the opportunity, but I also kind of like the chance to this is what I studied in college, this is part of my doctorate, and I've done this all my life. So I appreciate your indulgence on this. Thank you very much.
Any other questions for Co-Chairman Case? before we move to Rocky Mountain Power? None? Okay. Rocky Mountain Power. You're on deck. You bring the whole office? Mr. Kaysen, are you not joining him? Okay. Welcome. Make sure you give us your name and so who you are and what you do for the record.
Gotta have a green light.
There we go. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you. My name is Gary Hogeveen, President and CEO of Rocky Mountain Power, and I will let my colleagues introduce themselves. Let's go ahead and start down there. Sharon?
Yeah, good morning, committee. My name is Sharon Fain, and I'm Rocky Mountain Power's Vice President for Wyoming, and I'm based in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Good morning. My name is Joelle Stewart. I'm the Senior Vice President for Regulation with Pacific Corp. Rocky Mountain Power, sorry.
Morning, my name is Richard Garlish. I'm the, it's on, is it? Good morning, my name is Richard Garlish. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs and General Counsel for Rocky Mountain Power. And Rick Kaysen, our contract lobbyist, is also with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If it pleases, I'd like to start my discussion. And I believe we have a presentation that we could pass out.
Did you not send this to us?
It is, we're going to be projecting it. Yep.
Right, but did you not send it to us in advance?
I believe we did not. No, we
'Cause
brought it with us.
I don't have it in the materials. In the future, when you have something that you're going to present, it's helpful if you send it to us so we can put it in the materials. That way the public also has
Sure.
has it, and it becomes part of the permanent record on our website. Now it's not going to be part of that permanent record. So does that make sense?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We did submit it this morning, and copies were handed out to the panel and to the public and made available.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So maybe first, before I dive in, let me first say, Chairman Case, that was an excellent overview of the regulatory process and how rates are calculated. I want to be very clear about this rate case. It is going to be all about the E in your formula. It is specifically about the net power costs, which in my way of thinking are in the expense items that you had there. This rate case, which I will walk through, is 95% plus all about the net power costs, including fuel costs that we incur to serve our customers here in Wyoming and throughout our 6 states. So before I dive in, if you would bear with me with a little simple analogy. As Senator Case, Chairman Case noted, it can be very complicated setting rates for utilities. So I want to try to simplify this, and I want to give an analogy, an example that I think maybe we all have better understanding of in our daily lives. And I think it's very applicable to what's going on in this rate case for Rocky Mountain Power. So if you would indulge me for a minute, imagine Rocky Mountain Power is your local neighborhood gas station. So we provide the service of fueling up your vehicle with gasoline. Let's say that is exactly what our company is. That business essentially takes the commodity of gasoline and pumps it into your vehicles. That's the service we provide. We own the gas station. We are that provider, that retail provider. Our predominant cost in that example, in that analogy, is of course the fuel, the gasoline that we procure, and we procure it on the market. Say we get it from Exxon, Chevron, Sinclair, whomever gives it to us, or not gives us, but sells it to us at the best rate. That is essentially the fuel costs that go into our net power costs that are in the E in Chairman Case's example or his formula. So let's say in this analogy, for the last year or several years, you've been receiving service from us and paying $3 at the pump. And now we are saying, hey, it's going to cost $4 at the pump, a 25% increase, roughly equivalent to what we're talking about in this rate case of 22%. That increase in cost is entirely due 100% to the commodity, the natural gas, the gasoline in my analogy that I am pumping into your vehicle. I make no money on that gasoline. That is an entire pass-through That is an expense that we have to provide to you in that example of the neighborhood gas station. That is 100% analogous to what this case is all about. Our fuel cost from natural gas, from coal, from buying power on the market, as Chairman Case noted, all those things go into this net power cost calculation. It is 100% pass-through. I make no money on it. That went from $3 to $4 in my analogy. It's gone up 22% on us. That is 100% analogous. So that's what we're here to talk about. I will continue to refer back to that analogy, hopefully just to kind of grease the skids of what we're talking about. And now I think maybe I go into a bit more of the detail and the complications around what the utility really is. So if you will, I'll go to that next slide, please. I want to talk about who Rocky Mountain Power is briefly. We're very proud to be a Wyoming company with a long history of over 100 years. We serve roughly 150,000 Wyoming customers. We have over 1,000 Wyoming employees and a payroll of $134 million. We are a bedrock company in this state, and we are very proud of that. Not only have we had a great history, but we have a great future, as demonstrated by our willingness to invest in this state. We have $8 billion of physical assets located in Wyoming. Of our $32 billion, roughly 25% of our assets are here in this state. And we have the usage in this state compared to our 6 states is about 15%. So we have 15% of our customer base, our load is here in Wyoming, but 25% of our asset base is here in Wyoming. A demonstration of our commitment and love for the state, frankly. We are happy to give $500,000 a year in charitable giving. We'd love any of you, potential new projects that are of interest. We have quarterly giving sessions, and Sharon Fain would be happy to take any of those requests and evaluate those. We pay over $22 million annually in property taxes. Again, we're an important piece of this state and the community. We also are committed to the governor and the legislature's all of the above energy strategy. We have worked very hard to keep our coal plants open. We have negotiated with the EPA alongside the state of Wyoming proudly, and then we've succeeded. We have fought down the ozone transport rule. We've won that. That is nearly finalized. It's in the final kind of preparations at the EPA for us to essentially take Wyoming out of the ozone transport rule effect. That is an incredible win for the coal plants in this state. We have also worked with the Wyoming DEQ to settle with the EPA and avoid a shutdown of Jim Bridger's 1 and 2. Jim Bridger coal plant has 4 units. So half of the plant was essentially being threatened to be shut down. We have worked with the Wyoming DEQ to convert those to natural gas at the end of this year and continue to run those for years to come. Again, a very good win for Wyoming. And finally at Naughton, we had planned on shutting down Naughton 1, 2, and 3. That was a requirement by the EPA due to regional haze rules. Again, not our choice, but a requirement. We fought that and have now worked out a deal to convert all 3 of those to natural gas and continue to operate them in Kemmer on behalf of our customers to continue the low cost. We also are developing new technologies, including advanced nuclear. We have a partnership with TerraPower to build a new nuclear plant, the country's first advanced nuclear plant in Kemmer. So we will run those 3 Naughton power plant units I talked about earlier on natural gas until this new nuclear plant becomes available. Right now, TerraPower is telling us that's 2030 when that will become available, and that will be used for our customers again and keep their rates as low as possible. Last thing I want to say is that we also continue to execute on investments in renewable energy development. And I know that's a bit of a hot topic these days. And I think I want to clear the air. There is absolutely no increase in these rates due to renewable energy. Like I said before, 95+% of this is due to our fuel costs and net power costs increasing. The fact that we have renewable energy, and specifically wind energy here in the state of Utah, has actually lowered the potential increase. It would have been $85 million more. It's $140 million, which is incredibly high. And I absolutely understand the impact on families and businesses. Believe me, I've been around this state and I've talked to several of you and my customers and understand the impact that these rates have. I don't want to raise rates. This is not something I'm doing to make money for us. This is a pass-through, so I continue to be able to serve my customers reliably. With that wind power, I've reduced the 140 million, it would have been $220 million, but we reduced it by $85 million by being able to run zero fuel cost wind and acquire production tax credits from the US government. And all of that, 100% gets passed directly to my customers. I make zero money on any of that. Be very clear about that. The regulatory compact, Chairman Case, you did a great job of explaining what the regulatory compact is. I couldn't have done it better, and I won't really belabor the point. The simple fact is we are a monopoly. We are regulated by the PSC. We cannot just set our rates. We have to file these sort of rate cases, show that what we've done is prudent, argue for the right rate of return, et cetera, show the receipts, if you will, on our expense accounts of what we've purchased from fuel and power on the in the marketplace, and show that that was prudent for our customers. If the PSC says that was not a prudent purchase, that was imprudent, those expenses that we've incurred will be completely disallowed, 100% taken out. That's as it should be. We should be able to prove to you that what we've done is good, and not to you, excuse me, to the Public Service Commission, and prove to them that what we've done is prudent, and we absolutely do that. And for that, that is the compact. We have to serve anyone that appears in our service territory. We have an obligation to serve. We have an obligation at the rate that we have published in our public, it's called a tariff. At that rate, we have that obligation. So that is the regulatory compact, and we're very happy to continue to do business with it. I'll go to the next slide, please. This is a real brief summary, and the schedules are kind of outlined on the right-hand side in the chart. I won't dwell on those, but you can see they kind of vary, and they all get calculated based on specifics for those rate classes. But in the left, we filed this case on March 1st. It will be effective January 1 of next year, 2024. The proposed increase is $140 million, which is just under 22%. The typical residential customer average monthly increase is $16.20. Call it 50 cents a day. So I don't mean to minimize or diminish rate impacts on anybody. Again, I abhor having to raise rates. That is not my intention. My intention is to keep rates flat or reduce them. But I do want to just kind of maybe scale this as we're talking about 50 cents a day on a typical resident. And again, like I said, 97% of the cost are these net power costs that I talked about. It's the fuel. Going back to my analogy, it's the gasoline back in the tanks that I bought from Sinclair, Exxon, Chevron, et cetera. It's nothing to do with my business, what I've done, what I generate. It's the supplies I have to buy. And it is inflationary. There's absolutely something to that. And I will talk a little bit about what's driving that here in 2 slides. If I go to the next slide, please. As Chairman Case noted, there are 2 pieces to this. There are 2 filings. One that the general rate case, which is the $140 million. The second one here is this adjustment mechanism that the chairman was mentioning. This is a proposed increase. It trues up essentially, exactly as Chairman Case said. It trues up my costs. So my fuel for natural gas, coal, and again, buying power on the market, because we don't have enough generation. I want to mention something you did a great job of explaining. Well, maybe they should have enough generation ready to go always so that they can supply their customers and not have to buy anything on the market. That is a decision that we go through and we present in front of the commissions, and it is decided on what is prudent, on how much to build. And it has been shown, has been decided by the public service commissions in our states that we should not overbuild, because that's not the best way to serve your customers. There is a liquid market out there, and you can access that. And so the cost is at certain times it gets very tight. And like with anything, if supply is low and demand is high, it's going to cost more. And so it does on a few hours of the year, it costs a lot. it's getting tighter and tighter, this market. So this is something that I think in future cases we will talk about, that we should maybe build more. And we should build things that will allow us to not rely on the market as much, because the market is getting tighter and gets very expensive. And that is reflected in this annual true up. So as you note here, the proposed increase is $50 million. It's about $3.50 monthly for the average resident, call it another 10 cents a day. So now we're talking 60 cents a day between the two cases. That's what we're really talking about for our residents. It is increased fuel costs. And again, these are all passed through. We make no money on it. And to quote Chairman Case, we have to prove with our commissions that it's prudent.
Let me pause you right there. I got a question from Representative Chadwick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Hugavine, what is the cause of that tightening? What does Rocky Mountain Power see as the cause of that tightening in that aftermarket?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hughley.
Representative, terrific question. It's supply and demand, kind of breaking it down most simplistically. On the demand side, and that is the majority of the issue, we are seeing significant load growth throughout the West. And it's not just our service territory. When we talk about the market, it is now the entire West. So it's kind of everything from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. The entire western part of the US is connected in a grid. We have the largest portion, a large portion of that grid. The largest probably are some of the California utilities, but altogether we participate in a market currently. It's called the energy imbalance market. That is a real-time trading market. And we're able to take the lowest cost from here and the lowest cost there. But as a result, all of the available capacity, so on the supply side, is there enough generating sources? Those have been limited throughout the West, largely because you can't build new coal plants anywhere. There's essentially the EPA has made that impossible. You are shutting down coal plants, exactly like the discussion I had earlier. We have successfully not had to shut down any coal plants in Wyoming. We have converted some into natural gas, keeping the capacity, so keeping that supply available. But we certainly haven't been able to build new coal plants. We've built a lot of new renewables, and that has helped. But renewables are intermittent, and you have to factor that into your portfolio. When you build a new wind plant, you get about 30% on average throughout the year of that capacity back. So you have to build kind of 3 times as much wind to be able to get that. So throughout the entire West, you've got a rising load, rising demand, a falling supply, or at least not a growing supply fast enough. I wouldn't say it's falling. It's growing slightly, but there's retirements and there's new additions, so that the net growth is slow, but that demand is eating into it. So it's the two of those factors together.
Any follow-up, Representative Chadwick?
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to go back to the Naughton plant situation. Has that conversion taken place, and that what kind of investment on the part of Rocky Mountain Power?
Mr. Hughley?
Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thank you, Representative. The third unit, so there's 3 units there. The third unit in 2020 was converted to natural gas. The first 2 units are still burning coal. They will until the end of 2025. So the amount of investment on unit 3 was on the order of $10 million to convert that. That'll be roughly the same. It'll be a little bit more for units 1 and 2, but on the order of that kind of investment at the end of 2025. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I will continue.
Please proceed.
Yeah, thank you. If we can maybe go to the next slide, the net power cost increases. Thank you. And again, this is 95+% of what we're talking about for this case. These cost increases are really driven by market. They are commodity, 100%. Back to my analogy, it's the gasoline in the tank that I had to buy on the market. For us in the utility business, excuse me, we have fuel that drives our generation, coal, natural gas predominantly. We have all the renewable or non-emitting resources. Hydro, there's no fuel cost. Wind, no fuel cost. Solar, no fuel cost. So it's predominantly coal and natural gas. You see here the higher I'll go to the second piece. The natural gas prices at Opal have gone up almost 90% since 2020. inflationary pressures. It's super interesting. I'm going to take a quick aside here. I ran Kern River Pipeline for 4 years, about a decade ago. Kern River Pipeline was built in 1990, largely because of the efforts of the Wyoming Energy Authority. Tremendous work done by the Wyoming Energy Authority. It was built because there was too much gas at Opal in southwest Wyoming. There was no market for it, so pipelines had to be built. Kern River gets built. Northwest Natural gets expanded into the north. Ruby Pipeline gets built to the west. CIG and others get expanded going east. That has really done an amazing job for the natural gas exploration business, the production business in Wyoming, but it has caused a tightening of the market. And so that cost now is to get the gas out of southwest Wyoming, you have to pay a lot more. And that's a good thing for Wyoming, to be honest. It's a bad thing for my customers. So that cost has gone up by 90%. The cost of coal generation for us has gone up almost 40%. The market increase for coal has gone up almost 1,000%. We typically buy coal prices varying different, $30 a ton is not unheard of, $30 to $40 a ton throughout kind of Wyoming and Utah. On average, I mean, it's higher and lower, but on average, that's kind of what it was, $30 a ton. We now pay over $70 a ton on contract. If we want to access the market, it's $300 a ton. And a lot of that is due because the coal market is a global market these days, oddly enough. And I think, again, for our coal mining colleagues, this is good news for them. Again, bad news for my customers. Our costs are going up. But coal prices have gone up. For us, about just under 40%, kind of market-wide, 100+%. The back to the top bullet.
Mr. Hoogley?
Yes, please.
In your opinion, are these market changes part of just the typical ebb and flow of these resources, or are these increases abnormal since 2020?
Mr. Chairman, terrific question. Because these costs are going up, perhaps in a year or two, they're going to come back down. That is kind of underlying your question. I think that's something I've heard a lot. We talk a lot about. First of all, I have no magic ball. And if I did, I'd probably trade forward and try to make money on, if I knew. I don't. Some market fundamentals that will tell us a few things. First of all, the whole Opal discussion I had, the takeaway capacity is exceeding the production capacity in southwest Wyoming. That tells me that prices are going to stay high. Natural gas costs in kind of the Rockies Basin. That's probably true throughout everywhere. You can't build a pipeline, so that's helpful, right? You're going to have less and less takeaway, and if you can invest more money in producing, you're going to have more supply than you will takeaway or demand. So gas costs, I don't know. It's very location dependent. Coal prices, I don't think they're coming back down. I think hopefully they ameliorate a little bit. They come down, mediate a little bit, but moderate, there's the word I was looking for. They might moderate a little bit and come back down. I think with the overall pressure, compliance pressure, due to the EPA, where we are all having pressure to shut down coal plants early, and that's just a statement of fact. I'm not saying I like it, and I don't like it. But because of that, coal miners are realizing that they've got a limited future. And so their investment is becoming less and less. They are experiencing higher costs to mine, and therefore they're passing that along to us. They're seeing the end of their mine life, and they're going to have to extract as much value as they can. So if I had to guess, I'm saying costs are going to stay high, maybe moderate a bit, but probably stay high. Okay. Now, the last piece is the market prices. And that I talked about before, that's also a supply demand issue. And again, the load growth that we're all experiencing in the West and frankly throughout the country in the utilities is, I don't have a bullet here about that, but it's dramatic. Data centers, for example, you've all heard of data center and those load growth, that's real. There are thousands of megawatts of new load coming on that will compete for all of these resources. So the power markets are tighter and tighter. The costs are higher. Roughly, you look at that, you got 200% increase, 90% increase, 40% increase, and we're asking, kind of for a 22%. How were we able to offset all those costs? And that's what I have below. Again, I want to make the point here. Very very pointedly and very clearly, our wind assets saved $625 million off of that. That's company-wide. For Wyoming, that's $85 million, 15% of 625, $85 million. Our request would have been $85 million higher had we not had wind in our portfolio. I think we have a question.
Senator Scott, sorry.
Mr. Chairman, a couple of questions on.
Microphone, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, a couple of questions on the, that wind figure. First one is, do you own those wind resources, or do you buy power? And if you buy power that's generated by wind, is that in this, or is that in that purchase power thing that's going up? That's the first question, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hughley?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, we own the vast majority of wind, particularly here in Wyoming. We do also purchase some wind on contract. If we buy power in the market, some of it might come from wind. We don't necessarily know. I'll ignore that. But for the vast majority of it, we own it. If we do, and so then it appears, the owned resource would appear in Chairman Case's, the return on, but because there's no fuel component, so there is no net power cost. But for what we purchase, that would be done through a power purchase agreement that would appear in the net power cost.
Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, okay, the figure, you've got the 625 million.
Yep.
Or the 85 million for Wyoming. Now that's strictly comparing cost of fuel for other things with no cost of fuel for wind. Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially that is correct. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, am I right in thinking that the cost of producing wind, though, includes depreciation, includes maintenance, just the routine maintenance, all those kind of operating costs? And so those costs are not included in this figure, and that figure is significantly less than your 85 million because of those other costs. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, that is correct. So if you talk about actual, what we call life cycle costs or average cost over the lifetime of a wind farm or a natural gas plant or a coal plant, you factor in things like the cost of the capital cost, the return that we would get on it, and the fact that it has zero fuel. When you do that and you compare, hey, what makes the most sense right now? Build new solar, new wind, a new natural gas plant, a new advanced nuclear plant, or a new coal plant. Well, you're not going to build a new coal plant. So how about putting carbon capture on top of it, which we're absolutely in favor of looking into. So we compare all of those possibilities, investments, those ways of generating new electricity. And because of all of the production tax credits, which our customers get 100% the benefit of, wind and solar right now are absolutely the lowest cost life cycle over the 30-year basis to build of any generation of any sort. So you will build wind and solar, then you would build natural gas. And those, by the way, I'll just use numbers so we can kind of think about them. 3 to 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour wholesale cost for wind and solar, averaged over 30 years. Okay, 3 to 3.5 cents. To build a new natural gas facility, called a combined cycle facility, you're talking 5.5 to 6 cents. And about half of that is fuel cost. Okay. To build a new advanced nuclear plant, well, we're in the middle of that discussion with TerraPower at the moment. It's more than a natural gas plant. I probably won't say any more than that, but it's more. To build a carbon capture device on top of your coal plant, that has its cost and has its benefits, and that we are still currently studying, as you well know, Senator. Well, we're very active in that. That has a role, but that also then takes all sorts of other equations into matter, and which I won't go into. But on hey, what should you build new right now? That's the reason why we're all building renewables. It's the cheapest for our customers, but there's a limit. I can't build more than maybe 70, 80% of my total load in renewables because I can't serve the load. Now I can build every solar, I'm going to build batteries alongside it. That helps, but only shifting it 4 hours into the day. If I really want to serve my customers absolutely every hour, and of course I do, I'm required to do that, by the way. That is an absolute commitment and requirement by the Public Service Commission in every state, everywhere. I have to have something that I can dispatch. I can turn on, I can turn off, I can turn up and down. That's why I'm building the advanced nuclear plant. That's why I'm fighting like hell to keep the coal plants open. That's why I'm really invested in my natural gas plants, because those are the things I can turn on and off, up and down. Okay. But if you ask me what's the cheapest thing for my customer right now per kilowatt hour, it's wind and solar. So we're going to do that up to a point, and then we got to have the rest of it to keep lights on.
Hold on, let's see if Senator Scott, are you done?
For the time being, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Representative Haroldson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me just say, I understand you guys are between a rock and a hard place with the EPA. You have an energy portfolio requirement that's almost impossible. They've told you, hey, we need you to do this, but you can't do that. It's an impossibility. So I understand that. But with that being said, a couple questions. What is your portfolio makeup? So, I'm going to ask a series, and if you want to just knock them out as it goes. So what's your energy portfolio makeup? The other thing is this: talk to the fact that whenever you can't service load with a renewable, that you're buying energy, you're buying your power at top dollar, usually 9 times out of 10, because if you can't service it, a lot of others can't as well. So you're going to be paying for that, and it's going to usually come from either a fast fire generation or baseload generation. And then also talk to me about if your fuel costs are live market or delay. Because as we look at it right now, obviously you go natural gas August of 22 at $9.26 a therm. Oh, buckle up. That's expensive power. Where today we're sitting at $2.72 a therm. Coal was all the way up to $800 and some odd dollars a ton, but today it's $160. So are we live market in our purchase, or are we delay market? And as we see that offset. So let's start with those questions.
Mr. Hughley?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, let's buckle up. Okay. Energy percentage, roughly half of it is coal today. 25%-ish is natural gas. The rest would be non-zero emitting, which would be hydro, geothermal, wind, some solar. Most of that is most of that's hydro and wind together. Okay. If our renewables are not functioning, how do we backfill it essentially? So first of all, we forecast on the day how much we expect, and we're pretty damn good at that these days. That we've done it for a decade plus, since 2007, so a lot more than a decade plus, 15 plus years. And so we know, well, roughly we're going to get 2,000 megawatts worth at this hour, 1,500 this hour, that so forth. So that's how we plan our day ahead. So we get to the hour of the 5 minutes, 15 minutes ahead, then kicks in this energy imbalance market that I talked about before that we're a part. In fact, we founded it in 2014. That allows us to go out in the market and essentially get the lowest cost resource and exchange it for the fact that we're not available. And so fill it in, if you will. That sometimes can be very expensive. And there are hours of the day, and it's not just renewables. Let me just be super clear.
Yeah.
More often than not, it's our load has shown up more than we expected. It's hotter than we expected in Portland, for example, hotter in Salt Lake City, hotter in Rawlins and Rock Springs, those kind of things. The wind doesn't blow as much, those things happen, and so you adjust. Largely, you're able to do it within the EIM, and it's kind of, you get the lowest cost thing you possibly can. Occasionally, you have to go out and you say, oh my gosh, it's way hotter than I expected today than we set up yesterday. I got to go buy on the market in, Palo Verde pool or Mid-Columbia pool, and then you're going to pay a lot of money. We try not to do that. You do that as a last resort. So that's kind of an explanation. Sometimes it's because renewables don't show up. Probably more often than not, it's your load is fluctuating way more than you expected. Okay. Fuel costs, live or delayed, both. Mostly delayed. You get the chance right now in a general rate case where you set your costs. as Chairman Case noted, it's once every certain number of years. The last time we did it was 2021. So this is 2 years ago. It's stale as of, in fact, Chairman Case said it. The costs are stale the minute you file it. So that's the case. Now, with net power costs, we get to update that annually through this ECAM, or energy cost adjustment mechanism. So it adjusts annually. Okay. So when you file it, it's 2 years old now for us, but you get adjusted every year. And that's what exactly we're doing here, is we're kind of truing up to what we think the costs are relative to where they were 2 years ago and 1 year ago. Does that answer it?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Haroldson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it does. One thing I think that obviously we're playing in this world of a post-COVID crazy type, where steel went through the roof and rubber went through the roof, and all of these normal products that used to be a very affordable product now aren't. But now we're also seeing that market swing back.
Sure.
And so I understand that you guys are playing this huge game. Like you said, wish we had the ball. We don't. But just to respectfully push back, you said coal 300 a ton. Well, no, coal's 160 a ton.
Yep.
But just a couple weeks ago, it was 300 a ton.
Yep.
And so what we're seeing is that, and you guys, when you sit there and you're looking at $9 a therm and you're looking at 800 a ton, and you're like, we need 22% because we can't build the power. We can't generate electricity without having this. I totally understand that concept, but because of the swing, I start asking the question, if it is so driven by the fuel costs, we now see the swing. And I know you're making your adjustments, but even in 2 weeks' time, if you get a year out, well, a year ago, we were at 6 change for a therm and 475 a ton. Well, we're not today. And so I respectfully push back and say, where are we at that you're kind of, you're throwing darts at a board that's moving, but also I'm going to say from my experience, I've never really seen a rate decrease.
We have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. I'm proud of you. But that's for the people that we represent, their concern is that. And I'll also say that we just really want to make sure that, I think every person understands that an increase has to come in some way, shape, and form. If they're not, then they need to wake up to the fact that everything's increased. You guys have to pass that down to the rate payer. I get that. But at what point?
Yep.
And at what place? And then the last question, sorry, Mr. Chairman, and then I'll be quiet.
I don't know how he's even keeping track of all these questions,
Yeah.
or if that's just a long speech.
Coal versus natural gas megawatt price whenever you're doing conversion. So in other words, you're doing conversion on coal units.
Yeah.
So in other words, you're getting rid of your pulverizers, your conveyor belts, all of those systems, and you're going to a natural gas burner fired boiler.
Yep.
What's your price average? I understand not on the crazy levels, but average coal versus gas megawatt price.
Okay.
Mr. Hoogley.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, terrific. Let me first, your points are exactly right. We're trying to catch a tiger by the tail. The tiger's jumping up and down. It's rolling all over the place. These costs are essentially passed through. So in some regards, I don't care what they get set at in the rate case. They get updated through the ECAM. So yes, we are telling you they're very high. They're $136 million higher than they were in the past. And if you look down here on that lower right-hand corner, you can see what some of the numbers, the actuals, and they've jumped all over. But you can see that in 2021 and 2022, they increased dramatically, like from on average, 1.5 billion this is total company costs and just our net power costs, to over 2 billion in 2022. To the chairman's question earlier, where do I think they're going? Almost, you shouldn't believe me, and it doesn't really matter. I will chew it up to actual costs, and that is what will get put into rates. It is a timing issue. Chairman Case's point is exactly right on. Your point is exactly right on. It went up. We're showing you now in this rate case that it's high. That annual ECAM will true 100% of that back, okay? And that's our proposal, that it's 100%. We want to give 100% of it back, okay? That's exactly what we want to do. So 100%. that your last question about what's essentially the dispatch cost or the all-in the cost of fuel converted to electricity from coal, say at Naughton, to natural gas. I don't have the exact numbers, but I will tell you that depending entirely on where the natural gas market is, it can be higher or lower. Typically, it's higher, if I'm being honest. Yeah.
Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Hugham, thank you for being here. Appreciate your team being here. This means a lot to us, I know, and it means a lot to our constituents to learn all we can. You alluded to hydroelectric. I'd be interested in a little bit more of a dive on that. This drought across the West is impacting.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because we've benefited for many years with hydroelectric power, but it's been compromised a little bit, I understand.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, exactly. Thank you for the question. The significant drought that we've been in throughout the West has hurt our hydro assets for sure. The Pacific Northwest has typically done okay as far as precipitation on average throughout the last many years, decades. But for example, this last year, California and the Southwest had a lot of water, a lot of rain, as we all know, and welcome water. That wasn't necessarily so for the Pacific Northwest. Our hydro assets operate predominantly in Washington and Oregon. We have some in Utah as well, but the vast majority are in the upper Northwest. And they were under average. They were below average output. So yeah, I mean, drought conditions concern us. You can't also build new hydro for environmental reasons, which is frustrating. But because of uncertain water conditions going forward, I think you'll see hydro a smaller and smaller portion of our portfolio.
So just a quick follow-up. So what impacts less water means less pressure, less ability to turn turbines?
Yeah.
Help me a little bit with why that impacts what we're able to do. Are we literally shutting down, say at Lake Powell, for example? I'm just curious.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator. So there are, broadly speaking, two types of hydropower: dammed power, and then run of river. So dammed power is, I'm using the D word there to make sure you get
Dam power.
It's not dam power. Dammed up power is, as you can imagine, so it's like Hoover and Glen Springs, et cetera, where you have a certain amount of head is the right word, but elevation in your water. And so the more full your reservoir is, the more power you get out of it. It's just simply a function of how much pressure you can get through the turbine to spin it. And that's where the lion's share of hydropower is generated in this country, is through dammed up power. Run of river is the environmental friendly. You don't build a dam. You just have essentially a turbine that spins very laconically as the water lazes past. That doesn't give you much power. So I kind of ignore it mostly. Yeah.
Representative Knapp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've got a question. I'll try to narrow it down, and it will be a question in the end. But so I appreciate the analogy of the gas station. I'm a simple person. It's a simple example. But at a gas station, you would have your pumps representing coal, representing natural gas, representing wind and solar. And it's as if organized crime, which I'll just call EPA, comes in and says, we're going to limit you now to not selling from this pump, and we're just going to go with renewables. And we've talked about that, I think, last meeting, where over time, that is the goal. This is a snippet in time. These rate hikes are a snippet in time. This is going to go on for the future. So we as a body are trying to find solutions for taxpayers, for our citizens. And I don't care if you're from Wyoming or California or whoever's in the pact, it's all of us. So naturally, you don't have long-term contracts anymore for coal, which if you're going into the spot market, even for power, that's going to be high, extremely high. So we're passing that on to the taxpayer as well. The WEA just toured up in Gillette to L&H Industries. And one of the things they do is they actually repair windmills, which are averaging 5 years before a major overhaul. One of their major suppliers is in Australia, and they're so busy with production of reversing Germany back to coal, because Germany's kind of been steps ahead of us in this game and now is reversing itself and going 100% back to coal. My question is, we seem to be a hamster in a wheel, and we're all caught up in it. So whether it's, I don't blame you, but whether it's your part in the cog, or these coal-powered plants trying to retrofit first, which they went through that cost of, now trying to find some sequestration solutions, which were handed to them. We're all cogs in this hamster wheel that keeps going round and round. So you talk about no net power cost with wind. But then you talked about how much of that was tax credits or subsidized. So really, that's almost a fictitious number as well. What would be the cost without those subsidies and without those tax credits?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please.
Okay, so many things there. Let me answer your question directly here, there at the end. So net power costs for wind are zero, even without subsidies or anything. That's just the fact that there's no fuel cost to them. So the net power cost of wind is zero. In fact, if I want to be super technical about it, it's actually negative, because when I produce a megawatt hour of wind power, I get a tax break of roughly $35 a megawatt hour, 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which I then pass on to my customers. So net power cost for wind is actually negative by about 3.5 cents, which is super compelling to build it. Now, your point, and I will answer it. What does wind on the average for the 30 years cost? When I said it was about 3 to 3.5 cents subsidized, unsubsidized, you could add maybe 3 cents back to that. So call it 6 cents. And I think that's fair. Now, I also want to be very clear that I don't feel bad. I'm not embarrassed about taking advantage of the federal subsidies on behalf of my customers. I have saved my customers billions of dollars and that's kind of throughout the Berkshire utilities, because of these production tax credits that, again, I've passed on to our customers. They have benefited and paid lower rates in bills. Now, politically, I don't have a comment. I mean, if you want to say we shouldn't be subsidizing those, that is your job. That is not my job. But by taking advantage of them for my customers, very willing. Once they're out there, you bet I'm going to take advantage of them.
Representative Knapp?
Just one follow-up then. So having run businesses for a long time, there is a cost, because for every wind-generated plant, it requires an upside of probably 2 natural gas plants for any period that the flow isn't there. So that's an overall cost, I would say. To isolate one section and not include those factors in it, I think would be wrong, wouldn't you?
Mr. Chairman, respectfully, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think you can simply say, I've got to have my coal and natural gas plants, and let's build wind and not retire those at all, but I will just use their free fuel instead of paying the fuel cost here. Fuel cost can be $35, $40. Today, for coal and gas, it's much higher than that. It's more like $50 a megawatt hour. And all in, I've just built this zero fuel thing for $35 a megawatt hour. So I can simply use it as a fuel replacement and make money for my customers, save money for my customers, to be clear. So I think that has to be said. And also, we have found that if you build 100 megawatts of wind, you can count on about 10 to 20 megawatts of capacity, meaning that you can count on it when you need it. And so it's not that it's 100% fuel replacement. You actually get about a 10 to 20% capacity increase as well. So it's not quite that. I hear where you're coming from. It's a little better than that.
Representative Wiley?
I'd like to thank you for coming today. I have a quick question that pertains to, not DEQ and federal requirements, but how are you adjusting your portfolio and how you're countering with the Pacific Corp states and how they want to only purchase renewable energies into the future? How is that affecting the way that, you're recovering these costs, especially when it comes to transmission through Wyoming?
Yeah. Terrific. Mr. Chairman, eating a cough drop here so I don't cough on you guys. Thank you for the question. The representative, we are a 6-state utility, and we have to comply with our 6 state public service commissions. And the way we do that is through a planning process that takes into account all states' requirements. But it also has to include the non-imposition of other states' policies on the other states. So for example, Oregon has a policy, a state law, that says they cannot have coal in their rates past 2029. So by 2030, coal has to be out of their rates. That doesn't mean we are shutting down coal plants because of that. In fact, we're not doing that. What we're doing is making Oregon pay faster all of their bills. So the depreciation that entered into Senator Case's formula, the D, they have accelerated their payment of that. So whereas Wyoming's paying a penny of that, a kilowatt hour, whatever the numbers are, a penny a kilowatt hour, they're paying 3 pennies a kilowatt hour. Okay, so Oregon's rates are higher than Wyoming's for that very reason. They are accelerating their payments on coal plants. So by the end of 2029, they will not have them in rates. Now, we will continue to operate our system using the coal plants. And if they receive the benefit of that, they will actually pay higher rates for that. Okay, that's something that what's called the multi-state protocol, or the MSP, is working through. That process is a negotiation between, 6 different states and all the different parties, some of whom are here. I believe, Senator Case, you're a part of that. It is an interesting process, as I think the senator would attest to, that you are negotiating with parties with very different views and backgrounds the way to serve their power. But again, the requirement is that essentially in the end, we all agree that this is the way it's done. And the Wyoming state policies affect Wyoming. So carbon capture, for example, good example. If there's going to be a carbon capture mandate, as there is with HB 200, those costs will fall to the state of Wyoming. Just like the policy of accelerating coal coal out of their rates in Oregon and Washington, they have to pay that in rates by accelerating the payment. So it is a complicated process, but the principles are essentially that we continue to run the system as with the economies of scale of 6 states, but if you will, kind of the cost and the billing is done such that each individual state bears the responsibility of their policies.
Senator Landon.
So really appreciate that. That's got to be some of the most difficult work that you do. I'm just curious. I think I've heard that Oregon for sure, but maybe a couple of other states are not even interested in coal-generated power, even if the carbon is sequestered. Do I understand that correctly? And have you heard any movement on that level at all? In other words, if we do all that we can to provide clean energy with our carbon resources, is there any give in the states that really don't want coal-fired power?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I'll let my colleague Joelle Stewart, who's a little bit closer to that issue.
Ms. Stewart?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Senator Landon. Currently, no. Right now, Oregon and Washington, their laws don't allow coal-fired generation, even if it is emissions-free. at this time. So right now, no, we don't see movement on that. It would require legislative action in those states.
And no
Senator
conversation heading forward, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. No movement whatsoever that you've heard or any consideration being given in either of those states to notice what's being done on that front?
Ms.
No, I
Stewart?
mean, thank you. No, I mean, Oregon recently, in their most recent HB 2021, their most recent energy policy law, has actually moved to an emissions-based standard. So that would provide some ability to, if there's no emission, if it's emissions-free generation, but they also still have their prior law on the books that does not allow coal generation into rates. So right now, I do not see that change coming.
Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman. I represent a good part of Trump County in terms of the land area. So I notice that the irrigation increase is significantly less than the residential one. And let me say, I'm on the REA myself, but most of my constituents are with Rocky Mountain Power. How do I explain the difference between what's the increase for residential and the lesser increase for irrigation?
Ms. Stewart?
Thank you, Chairman. Senator Scott, so we do a cost of service study, and so probably the largest driver of that is usage at the peak. So we look at each class's load, what their usage is required at the peak, and allocate resources accordingly. So residential customers are going to be one of the drivers of the peak, so they will have a larger allocation of costs than irrigation customers.
Okay. Representative Ottman? Representative Ottman?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was trying to get unmuted. First, I have a question of just clarification for my own mind, and then I have a question. First off, are you, the gentleman that's been speaking, I had it down as Hooverveen. Are you the president of Rocky Mountain? Are you affiliated with Pacific Corp? How is that separated out? Because you keep talking about your customers. I'm wondering, who are your customers? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes, I am President and CEO of Rocky Mountain Power, headquartered in Salt Lake City. Our division of PacifiCorp is a utility, a standalone utility, part of PacifiCorp. There are two divisions, two utilities. Rocky Mountain Power, the one that I have the privilege of leading, is headquartered in Salt Lake City, serves Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho. Our sister utility is Pacific Power, and that is a utility headquartered in Oregon, and they serve Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Together, we are PacifiCorp. PacifiCorp is a company that really doesn't have employees per se. We have assets, and those assets are the generation assets and the transmission assets. The distribution assets are owned, if you will, are essentially operated within the utility. But there is one company, and it is called PacifiCorp, and we operate as two separate divisions and two separate utilities. So when I say my customers, I really mean Rocky Mountain Power's customers, Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho.
Thank you. Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, follow up, Representative Ottman.
Okay, so when we look at Oregon, and I just heard that Oregon says no coal, and it's as per their state law, are they not receiving power then if it's not all generated through wind and solar? So I'd be wondering how they are receiving power, number one. And number two, with the fuel costs, what I've been seeing, okay, so we're in the Wyoming, Utah part of that. So when you're doing this purchasing, and I see that the utility Pacific Corp has been mandated to get as much energy as they can because of the blackouts in California. And I also see that there's wind going out into the ocean, and that's definitely going to be very, very expensive with the pilings and just all of the things that go on there, plus just the idea of how to get somebody out there to service it. But how is all of that? And I see here that there's been purchases over the last up to 3.3 billion for a strategic reliability reserve. So if we're watching the market and the fuel is going down, if we're gobbling up as much as we can get, we're really not being cognizant of buying at the best time. So how is all that going to work? I guess what I'm wondering is, as the utility itself, you need to, because it's mandated that you have those services or you can be fined. I see that. How is that affecting us and our service? Thank you.
Mr. Hugiven?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative, I'm not sure I've completely followed that. Let me try to answer it the best I can. We operate our utility, 6-state utility. We do what's called single dispatch. We optimize the entire load and our generation portfolio for it. So we don't say, oh, hey, we can only serve the west side with non-coal resources. That's not how we are doing it. And again, currently, and for what's in this rate case, to be extremely clear, none of that really applies yet. Oregon and Washington don't have to be out of coal until, well, Oregon until 2029, Washington, when are they out? 2025. So for this case, it is operating all as kind of is, but the dispatch for the entire 6 states is done on the least cost, least risk basis. So we dispatch our resources by what's in the market, what is the lowest cost. Okay. I want to be super clear about that. It's very much, very important. The way we plan for future resources is through this integrated resource plan, which you may have heard about. It also takes into account the 6 states, and then specifically, if there needs to be a resource that is in the future past, say, 2029 for Oregon that will benefit Oregon and not, the other states such as Wyoming, then Oregon will pay those costs. And I can have maybe Joelle talk a little bit further about what might come to happen through the MSP process to do all that. But I think maybe let us just say, for now, what's in this rate case is that it is absolutely all included and it is all uniform dispatch lowest cost.
Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, follow up on the previous question. As I understand, your parent company has 2 subsidiaries, one which deals with those 3 West Coast states and one which deals with Utah, Wyoming, and what little you have in Idaho. Why would it not be advantageous to split the protocol then and have one protocol that's covering those 3 Western ones and another one that just covers our 3 states, so that, because the rate setting philosophies, I think, between the states are very different.
Yeah.
What would happen if we tried to push things that way?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, great question, and I'll let Joelle give her thoughts on this too. It's complicated, but I think overall we are pretty adamant that we have economies of scale at the 6-state level that have for decades given very low cost power to our customers. And on behalf of our customers, we believe that splitting the MSP protocol, if you will, and dispatching the East and the West separately, we will both suffer from the lack of economies of scale. For example, the hydropower, where does it go? It's very low cost. And would that stay all in the Pacific Northwest? Well, a lot of Wyoming in the past has paid for that. It's those kind of questions that I think get very difficult. And who gets the wind in Wyoming? Is it all Wyoming? Well, there's more wind in Wyoming than you can use. Should that go to the West? Should all of it go to the West? Well, there's very low cost associated with it. Do you want to have higher rates in the East because all the wind goes to the West? There are those questions that, as Senator Case can attest to, happen in the MSP process. We have those discussions. It's not off the table by any sense. We're actually very happy to have those discussions, but we do have a very strong preference that our customers are not harmed through some sort of MSP split. I think that's a basic tenet of ours. Joel, thoughts?
Ms. Stewart?
Thank you, Chair. Senator Scott, I mean, Mr. Hogevane's correct. I mean, the basic answer right now is efficiency. And as we've been working through our multi-state process with all of our stakeholders, this has been a frequent topic of discussion over the last few years, particularly as those Pacific Power states have changed their energy policies with requirements to get out of coal, with requirements for non-emitting generation. And so we are addressing that. But through the work with our stakeholders, there's also been recognition and a strong interest that retaining some level of dynamic sharing of resources and costs and risks has been beneficial to all of our customers. Now that is evolving and it is going to change, but we do right now still anticipate some level of sharing of low-cost resources across all of the states. But then as we look to address and procure new resources to satisfy the needs of specific states, including Wyoming, with like carbon capture, to meet the low carbon standard for Wyoming, HB 200, we have to address that where we can better situs assign new resources to those individual states. And that's the process we're currently working on. We have a little bit of extra time to do that since those Pacific Power states don't have to be out of coal until the end of this decade. So it's we meet about every 6 to 8 months with about 35 different parties across all of our states to have these discussions and look at different modeling and incorporate different ideas.
Representative Newsom?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your opening remarks, you commented on the price increase that would happen on a residential customer. And then now we have our large industrial customers, and many of them produce the energy that you're using. And so I'm wondering if we're creating this upward spiral of pricing where you raise your price, they raise their price, you raise your price, they raise your price. And I'm wondering if you see that as a problem and where that might take us rate-wise as we're seeing this inflationary pressure on the industries that you are buying your fuel from.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative, no, I think it's an insightful question. We are requesting more, begging even, more supply of natural gas to appear in the market. It will benefit all of us. Yes, I understand in talking to all of our customers, some of them, particularly the smaller ones, have a real concern about a 25% increase in their electricity costs. It's not everyone that has that kind of impact. Not all of these fields are electrified, for example. Not all the pipelines use electric compression. They have a lot of natural gas compression. So it is probably not as severe as what you're talking about theoretically. I think more than likely, high natural gas costs are going to send the signal to invest in new exploration, and we'll see the opposite. We will see more gas appearing. But your question is accurate. I mean, it has the potential if they need to raise their rates. Now, the fallacy is that they don't raise rates simply because of their costs, right? It's a supply issue. So, but to your point, if they go out of business, then the supply reduces. But I think there's probably more than enough capacity from the large the majors, if you will, to make up for it. But I'm speculating now. Your point is still well made.
Representative Knapp?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Going back to the hamsters in the wheel, if we had 20 million hamsters in wheels, how much, no, I'm just, that multi-state protocol, as I understand it, renews in January. And if so, how long of a term do those go?
Ms. Stewart?
Chairman, Representative Knapp, it's currently we have an agreement among the parties for a 2-year extension. The last protocol, we call it the 2020 protocol, ends at the end of this year. With the 2-year extension, it will go to the end of 2026.
Any follow-up, Representative Knapp? No. Senator Scott?
End of 2023 or
6.
2024?
2026 with the extension, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I can continue. I've got a couple.
Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, let me ask. One, because I do hear people saying, well, the solution would be just total deregulation. And if we were to do that, and because of the costs that are being imposed from the outside, somebody took away all your customers here. How would that affect the costs that are involved in this multi-state protocol?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, so that's a whole new kettle of fish, and that is a large and stinky kettle of fish. Deregulation really has been a failure almost everywhere it's been implemented. I'll say that as a general rule. The deregulation examples of California in particular, but also Montana closer by, have really indicated that the price signals that get sent when sharp price spikes happen due to supply and demand imbalances are intolerable by most every customer. So theoretically, and I bow to Senator Case's economics degree here, but as I understand it, the situation, deregulated market in anything is meant to facilitate the signal process. So if supply gets out of whack with demand, there's more demand than there's supply, prices go up, and that incentivizes someone to go build something to make more supply. That happens great when it's a few days turnaround between that you can adjust that. And so prices stay high for a few days or weeks or months or whatever. But this is in our business for a price signal to be received and processed and implemented through the PSC to build a new generation station. It's 3 to 5 years. So my grandmother would be paying very high rates due to the deregulated markets when that happens, and it will. And the deregulated market is great when there's an abundance of supply. This is what we've seen everywhere. But then as soon as load outpaces it and markets get tight again, price signal jumps. Now it's 5 years of pain that just are intolerable. And so what you saw in California, despite all the nonsense around get shorty and all the manipulation, which was real and terrible. But what happened is that then the government steps in and says, no, this is terrible. Now we can't have an unlimited price signal. We have to cap the price. And now you start blowing up deregulation. It doesn't work. That's my economics understanding of it. I think practically, when you talk about deregulation, what that means is a lack of reliability, because simply for the same kind of thing, you're going to have less and less reliable resources. You don't have one organization that is regulated and made to, held their feet to the fire and, make sure that services are reliable and affordable. And that's exactly what happens when we go in front of the Public Service Commission. They audit all our books. They say what you've done is either prudent or imprudent. It's in the interest of Wyoming ratepayers or it's not. And they take action. And that keeps costs very low and reliability very high. I think that's why a deregulated market for utilities doesn't work.
Representative Wiley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, let's take a step beyond deregulation. Let's talk about if we adjust our third-party generation statutes and we allow the industrial, consumers to start generating their own power, because I'm hearing from a lot of my mining industries and stuff from back home that this rate increase is gonna cripple the industry, put them out of business. So if this third-party generation takes place, how is that going to affect the ratepayers at home that are the residential customers?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wiley, so they do currently build their own third-party generation. We have many customers, many customers that have generation behind their meter that they use for themselves. They aren't, if they want to sell it to the general public, then they have to go through a process called the qualifying facility process, which they can do. And they just receive a certain rate back, which is determined by the Public Service Commission, what rate that is. So they absolutely can do it today.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Wiley.
So just to clarify, just a wider growth of those private industrial consumers starting to take on a third generation on themselves. What would that do if you lost those customers within Wyoming to the residential customers?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, I don't want to lose any customers. I don't even like the fact that when they build third-party generation behind their meter, I don't like the fact that we lose that power. I think in general, it is much better for our customers to be able to spread out the cost of these kind of rates we're talking about in our rate case. And so the fewer customers I have, the worse it is for the rest of the customers in that state. So 100% would rather not have the large customers generate their own power. Now, if they can do it for less costs, I want to talk to them because I will, and I have negotiated with these customers to make sure that we maintain their lowest cost alternative. And we have a process through the Public Service Commission, very public process, where we're able to negotiate contracts for large customers. Now, by and large, when you dig into the details, they're generating with natural gas, which is can be very high cost, as I showed you here, went up 90%, year on year. So for the most part, those customers don't want to do that because that's then their only source of fuel. The great thing about having a utility with 6 states is that we have for our customers a diversity of fuel supply. So I've got some without any fuel cost. I've got some with gas costs. I have some with coal costs. If they build something behind their meter, they have now gone 100% in on whatever that fuel is. And so they ride that roller coaster of very significant volatility. So typically they don't like it. But if they think they can do it for cheaper, we're absolutely willing to talk to them. And if they can prove to us they can, we go in front of the commission and say, we should adjust the rate so that we can keep them because it's better for all the customers in the state if they pay part of the bill.
Representative Wiley.
So do the West Coast states, are they in these new negotiations for the multi-state protocol, are they willing to pay a premium for their requirements for energy consumption?
Chairman, Mr. Wiley, Representative Wiley, yes, absolutely. They are today paying a premium. Just if I'm following your question, they're paying a premium for their policy, which is they're accelerating the depreciation of coal. So the fact that they went out of coal faster, they are paying more for that. So their rates are higher than your rates.
Representative Haraldson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So looking at the kilowatt price, we're way higher in Wyoming than Oregon and Washington both. We're at, right now, as of September 2023, Wyoming's at $12.30 a kilowatt, and Washington's $9.79, and Oregon's $11.02. And so I don't know, maybe it's wrong, but that doesn't look quite like they're paying to shut our coal-fired power plants down. That looks more like we're paying and they're shutting them down.
Chairman, Representative, I'd have to look at what your numbers you're talking about. That is not the fact as I know it. More than likely, we're comparing apples and oranges. So there's all sorts of ways of quoting rates. The way we typically do it, and the way I've done it on the last slide here, is the average for all customers in that state is quite possible. Some classes of customers pay more because their class costs more, as Joel was talking about earlier. So it's possible the numbers you're talking about are, say, a residential customer versus a commercial or industrial or average of some sort. So I'd have to look into it. But my understanding is absolutely that Wyoming's costs are lower on average.
Representative Haraldson, where are the numbers that you're looking at? Where are you getting that from?
I'll just email this out to the committee.
Yeah, thank you. Representative Ottman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question. When we talk about residential, you were saying, oh, it averages out about 60 cents a day. In that residential, is that including, because I don't know if there's large industry, small industry, how about for buildings like school buildings and refrigeration units and grocery stores? What designation are they under? First, that's my first question.
Ms. Stewart?
Chairman, Representative, so we have multiple types of classes, and we classify customers based on what's similarly situated. So residential, pretty uniform, usage, around 900 kilowatt hours a month on average. For those other customer types, we have different, we call rate schedules. So I think in what Mr. Hogeveen showed on the slides, those fall into general service, and they're determined based on sort of maximum load for that customer. And then through our cost of service process, we look at that class, what their usage is, what the cost of serving that class is relative really to all of the other classes in the state, and then calculate the rates accordingly from that. I hope that answers your question.
Representative Ottman?
Yes, it does. Follow up, please.
Please proceed. Go ahead.
Okay, so when we're looking at the cost of service to people, are we taking into consideration that the cost to the ratepayers is not just on that 900 kilowatt hours per month? It is also on the services such as grocery stores and schools and government buildings and whoever else uses energy that comes back onto the citizens of that state. Just as a state like California has exceeded their need and is why they've had those severe blackouts. And so I imagine, well, it's written that you all are preparing for that by building things and getting extra fuel and stockpiling and storing and doing all those things. How is it that we haven't really increased our need, or maybe we have that I'm not aware of, in the state of Wyoming to be responsibly not pressing the grid over what it's able to do?
Chairman, Representative, we are very happy to invest in the system in order to build our supplies or build our access to supplies, build our transmission, build generation to the extent we can. This is, again, something we go through our integrated resource plan. And that is the process by which is very public, and many of you perhaps are aware and perhaps have even participated in. There's always a pressure, I'll say, from parties that know the utility, you shouldn't invest. You shouldn't be, because if you invest, you naturally raise rates in order to recover those investments. But it can offset higher other costs. So for example, market costs. So that's exactly the process we go through in a very public way that says, here's what we think we should build, what we should buy in the market, what the transmission we should build, the generation we should build. And we welcome anybody's participation in that process.
All right, well, Representative Chadwick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hogeveen, I believe everybody on this committee has heard about the recent court case against Pacific Power, where 17 homes were destroyed, or they got sued over 17 homes that were destroyed in a fire. Those 17 homes were part of 2,500, but the settlement was, I believe, $70 million. Does that affect Wyoming ratepayers? How does that figure in to this overall picture?
Chairman, Representative Chadwick. So there were 17 plaintiffs. It was a $90 million verdict. It wasn't a settlement to your point, just correct. It is not included at all in these rates. That is an ongoing prosecution of that case. We have appeals pending. We feel very good about our appeals. We think there were many, many errors made in that. The vast majority of that $90 million was non-economic and damages. The actual economic damages, i.e. paying for the structures that were destroyed in timber, et cetera, was $4 million. That's a reasonable number that we will settle with reasonable people. So that's the process we're going through. There's still plenty of, there's, I don't know, 4 or 5 years before this actually gets resolved. It could potentially settle out before that if we get more reasonable sorts of negotiations. But in the meantime, we are appealing it and feel good about it.
All right, let's get back to the presentation.
Okay.
I believe you have a couple
Yeah.
more slides left.
Yeah, I just have a couple more slides. Thank you. If I go to the next one, the commodities comparison, I just want to make this point. We are the squiggly line on the bottom, the light blue one. This is a percentage change from January of 2018, and it's comparing average our electric price in Wyoming, the little squiggly light blue line, a gallon of regular unleaded gasoline, and a therm of gas, i.e. natural gas, a purchasable unit of natural gas. And I think you can see that commodity costs are real. Our commodity prices have been very muted, and we work very hard to do that. So these, gasoline isn't a fuel of ours, of course, but natural gas is, as is coal, as I mentioned before, and electric power market purchases. They're very volatile. The rest of our business is very large, and we are able to adapt, and we keep it low. So yes, this is a very large increase. I'm happy it's not larger. It is all 97% of it is commodity driven. And I just want to keep making that point. And we're happy that it isn't as volatile as other commodities out there. The next slide, please. Also, when you look at just a cost of living comparison, we have all experienced significant inflationary pressures, really since the pandemic. And I believe it was mentioned here earlier. Our rates there on the blue have gone down. I think someone mentioned earlier, I don't ever remember rates going down. They did in 2017 to 2018 and below. They are now coming back up for sure. And we're asking for this 22% increase. In this rate case, it will bring that blue line up in the future. But it will stay below really where cost of living index and just another example of power prices here in the state. Finally, where are our rates in comparison to our area and our, if you will, our competitors, our fellow colleague utilities around the Intermountain West? I think as you can see, we are low. This is information from 2022, and you can see, for the vast majority of our colleagues, we are considerably lower in rate than they are. Now, this average of 7 cents, this is what I was mentioning earlier, Representative. This is and Joel, correct me, but I believe it's an average of all customers.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what that 7 cents. To be fully disclosed here, this is 22 information. So all of these utilities, this is based on 2022 rates. Per our filing, our rates are going up, as we've all discussed here. So should all of that get enacted, that 7 cents goes to something less than 9 cents, which if everyone else here rates stay the same, which they will not, they will also all go up because they are all experiencing the same inflationary commodity pressure. But if they didn't, we would move up 2 places. Again, like I say, I expect all of it to move out roughly that 10 to 20%, if not maybe 30% for some. So anyway, where we are today, again, very proud of being low cost. We are committed to staying that way. We don't like raising rates. We love decreasing rates. And we hope to do that in the future. With that, that is the end of our presentation.
Committee, any additional questions for Rocky Mountain Power? Co-Chairman Case?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It might be useful, Mr. Chairman, if Mr. Hogeveen would describe the capital projects that the company has underway and how they impact, what they're for, how they impact these rates, or how they might impact rates in the future. And maybe how they're shared in the multi-state protocol.
Mr. Hogovine?
Yeah, Chairman, no surprise, difficult question, simple in request, wide in scope. And I'll have Joelle help me out here. Let me describe the current capital campaign, if you will, the projects under construction. First of all, they all have to get what's called a certification of public convenience and necessity by the state here in Wyoming when they're built in Wyoming. We also have to get, it's abbreviated, I'm going to use the abbreviation CPCN. We have to get a CPCN from the state of Wyoming, even when it's non-situs, i.e. something is being built in a different state in our service territory. So my point there is the Public Service Commission sees all of this and they go through the applications and say, yes, it's needed, and go forward. That happened for back in 2020, I'll not go back too far, but in 2020, we built Gateway West, which also enabled much wind to be built in eastern Wyoming, roughly 2,000 megawatts of new wind. Subsequent to that, it was approved in the CPCN proceeding, and we are under construction right now of about 400 miles of very large capacity, 500 kilovolt conductor. Excuse me. Yep. New transmission line that we're calling Gateway South, which runs from eastern Wyoming into central Utah. It is also enabling about 2,000 megawatts of new wind to be built in eastern Wyoming. Those are the large pieces that we're building. We're also, of that 2,000 megawatts, we're building about 600 megawatts of that ourselves in two projects called Rock Creek 1 and 2 in Wyoming. And then the rest of it will be power purchase agreements that we will undertake, execute with third-party developers of wind in Wyoming. That's probably the highlights. And then maybe do you want to mention what's actually in this rate case?
Ms. Stewart?
Thank you, Chairman. In this case, there is a portion of that Gateway South line in rates. We have a 2024 test period. That line is slated to go into service at the end of 2024. So only a portion of it's like 1 month of the cost of that project are included in those rates. We also have two very small wind projects that we acquired and are repowering that are located in Wyoming, Foot Creek 2 through 4 and Rock River, which are very small, about 50 megawatts each. Those are also in the case, as well as a portion of the Rock Creek 1, which is a small 140 megawatt wind project that will connect with the Gateway project. That comes in also at the tail end, so a portion of that is in the revenue requirement request in this case as well.
Chairman, if I may add, they are in the case, and they are important to talk about and responsive. They are not the driver. As I said before, 97% of this is the net power cost. These costs essentially get paid and kind of washed through the system. There's costs that go up, costs that go down, and kind of everything else is essentially kind of washing out. So I just want to be super clear about it.
Senator Case?
So, Mr. Chairman, would it be fair that there will be more costs to come in the future for projects that are ongoing or haven't been started yet? And that'd be fair, wouldn't it?
Mr. Chair, Senator Case, yes, it is fair. Once, obviously, only 1/12 of the cost will be put in for Gateway South. Those costs will go in the next case. However, also more costs will go up and down, and presumably, as I think we've mentioned here, these commodity prices could foreseeably decrease, offsetting some of those costs. So I can't say that we will be in here for a large increase due to those capital costs, because there'll be a lot of other things that can offset it potentially.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Two more questions.
Yep.
One still related to this. What is the projected lifetime of those assets?
Mr. Chair, Senator, yeah, the transmission assets are 60 years plus. The wind assets, I believe, 30 years. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I'd also, if I could, ask some questions in a slightly different area.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, with respect to the company's charitable projects, and you have one called the Blue Sky Program, and I believe the ratepayers don't pay anything for that. Is that correct? And maybe say what that is. I'm not sure if people know.
Ms. Stewart?
Thank you, Chairman. Senator Case. The Blue Sky program is a voluntary program for customers if they want to support green energy and we purchase renewable energy credits on behalf of those participants. It is completely voluntary. The cost of that program are not included in base rates, are not included in this case at all.
Senator Case?
Mr. Chairman, just a couple of follow-ups on that. Mr. Chairman, on an ongoing basis, how do those folks, do they have a special tariff for the Blue Sky? As I understand Blue Sky, it helps with the capital costs of renewable installations for customers that are, it is a donation from the company to help with those costs for deserving customers. For lack of a better way, I might be saying it poorly, but we often see nonprofits take advantage of the program, and it's, you know, it's a good program. But what about the ongoing costs? How do the rates that those customers are charged on an ongoing basis, how do they compare to other rates? And we have a program in Wyoming that you're very familiar with, I think, called net metering.
Yeah.
And you've testified in the past, your representatives have, that the net metering program in Wyoming imposes costs on other residential customers because they don't contribute fully to capital. Is that also true of the customers that receive a capital contribution from your Blue Sky program?
Ms. Stewart?
Thank you, Chairman. Senator Case, yes. Now I see where you're going. Yes. So as part of our Blue Sky program, when there are costs, when we have more costs than, or when we've collected more money than we need to actually purchase the renewable energy credits, we have a portion of the program that provides grants to like charitable organizations. We have an RFP, customers can bid in for a grant to help fund solar rooftop for those organizations. And there's a vetting process. There's usually a limited pool of funding. I think and Sharon may know the specifics. Some airports, certain charitable organizations have gotten these grants. When they have those grants and they have that rooftop solar, yes, they go on the net metering program. So that they are then credited on a dollar for dollar, not dollar, they're credited on a kilowatt hour basis for the generation from that resource compared to their actual usage.
Final follow-up.
Senator Case?
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. So it might be fair to characterize that your charitable activities on the front end are supported, or it cause impacts to the rest of the ratepayers in the residential class that don't enjoy solar net metering benefits on the back end on an ongoing basis. And, you know, it's not really a gotcha question. I've been trying to illustrate to people what net metering does to the rest of the customer class forever. And I think you even agree that we need to reform those tariffs. I can see your heads nodding. So it's not a gotcha question, but that's true, isn't it?
Ms. Stewart?
Mr. Chair, yeah, let me answer.
Please. Go ahead.
100% agree. And if you want to change the net metering,
I've tried.
we would be with you. Yeah, we think there's a more fair way to do it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Do we have, Representative Ottman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this may have been answered with the Rock River and the Rock Creek things. But when he was speaking earlier, he was talking about the Gateway South and that it went from eastern Wyoming to central Utah. That's quite a distance. So that's kind of what I was wondering, like how that, you know, normally you hear eastern Wyoming or western Wyoming, but to go from eastern Wyoming across, is that what that includes, is these smaller projects that are going to be going on? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Representative, yeah, so we have the Gateway West project that I mentioned earlier that we built in 2020, which does go straight across Wyoming from east to west. But we have to, essentially model and design our transmission system so that all of the electrons go from where they're generated to where they're consumed. And the vast majority of our electrons get consumed in the Wasatch Front, in frankly, all of PacifiCorp across the 6 states, but certainly in Rocky Mountain Power, our 3 states. And so to get them to the Wasatch Front going across west, you still have to build something north to south, which is from Populous to Terminal, as we call it, which is down into Utah, or you come up from the south, from Mona up into the Wasatch Front. And so we're doing both, essentially. So you always want to build a loop because it is much more reliable for your customers. And so this is essentially kind of completes a loop that goes from eastern Wyoming into Idaho, down into the Wasatch Front on the north side, and on the south side, eastern Wyoming through Colorado into central Utah and up, and essentially making that a loop of very high reliability.
Follow-up, Representative Ottman?
No, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
All right, thank you. All right. Is that all you have for us?
That is all we have.
Okay, well, we appreciate your testimony and appreciate you taking the time to answer all of our questions. We do have public comment on this topic, but let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and do public comment.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I also would like to add thanks to the company for coming in.
Yeah,
I think this was really useful.
thank you. I don't think we have that. Okay. Not the bills, yeah, just go through anything else you want to talk about. But I think we want to take, so we don't get confused, I think All right, welcome back from the break. I said that we were going to do public comment, but before we do that, I'm going to invite Rocky Mountain Power up one more time because we had a question regarding rates in comparison to other states. And they've had an opportunity to review the information that we're looking at, and they have a response, so we can be a little more clear on what that looks like. Ms. Stewart?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, thank you, Representative Haraldson. I looked at that link. Those are average rates by state, not by utility. So those do not necessarily represent our rates. Particularly in Washington and Oregon, we are not the predominant utility. And in those states, there's also a lot of publicly owned utilities that have access to preference power from the Bonneville Power Administration and have typically lower rates than the investor-owned utilities like Pacific Power.
All right, Representative Haraldson likes the answer.
Okay,
And I
thank you.
see no other questions. Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Oh, maybe. Senator Scott,
Mr. Chairman, she lost me on the curve. Which,
light up your mic there. Oh, it's lit up.
yeah, Mr. Chairman, this rate comparison slide?
No, it's a website link that Representative Haraldson was looking at
Oh,
that
okay.
compares all the states.
Oh, okay, not this.
Nope, not that slide. All right. Let's move to public comment on anything that Rocky Mountain Power presented or questions that were posed by the panel of legislators. Welcome.
Good morning.
Morning.
Chairman Olson, Chairman Case, members of the committee here today. My name is Abby Briggerman. I am an attorney at Holland & Hart. I want to begin by thanking you for holding this hearing today, for setting the agenda that you have, and allowing me the opportunity to speak. I represent the Wyoming Industrial Energy Consumers, or WIAC. It's an unincorporated association of approximately 20 very large industrial consumers, all of whom take electric service from Rocky Mountain Power. Collectively, WIAC members represent approximately half of Rocky Mountain Power's Wyoming load. They are major producers of natural gas, oil, trona, soda ash, phosphates, and sulfuric acid. WIAC members employ thousands of people in Wyoming and make up a sizable percentage of Wyoming's economy in terms of both jobs created and taxes paid. Employees of WIAC members work in most of the state's counties. WIAC has been in existence for over 20 years, and it actively participates in proceedings before the Public Service Commission. WIAC's goal is to keep costs of electricity low while still ensuring service is reliable. For WIAC members, the cost of electricity is one of the most significant, if not the most significant, cost of doing business in Wyoming. A WIAC member's monthly electric bill can be in the millions of dollars. Low electricity bills are vital to the health of WIAC member businesses and also critically important to the state of Wyoming to be able to compete for business. WIAC has intervened in both of Rocky Mountain Power's its general rate case, as well the ECAM proceeding, the Energy Cost Adjustment Mechanism proceeding. WIAC is fighting those rate cases hard with a team of expert analysts that have thoroughly vetted Rocky Mountain Power's applications. In both proceedings, WIAC has proposed significant adjustments to Rocky Mountain Power's filed cases. And in fact, in the rate case, WIAC's testimony supports an overall rate decrease, not an increase. I want to emphasize, though, that all of WIAC's adjustments in both cases help all ratepayers, residential, commercial, and industrial ratepayers. To the extent that WIAC is successful in the two cases, all of Rocky Mountain Power's Wyoming ratepayers will benefit. I want to take a second to address one thing that Mr. Hoogeveen was talking about earlier this morning, and that's the pass-through impact of net power costs. Mr. Hoogeveen correctly stated that Rocky Mountain Power does not earn a return on net power costs. That is true. However, I do want to emphasize, and this is very important, It does not mean that Rocky Mountain Power has no control over the impact or the entire scope of the net power costs it is asking for. It can certainly do many things to minimize those net power costs. By way of example, Rocky Mountain Power has an extensive hedging policy. To the extent they hedge well or poorly, that will impact their net power costs. So yes, power costs are passed through, but that does not mean that Rocky Mountain Power does not have a significant role in keeping those power costs low. I want to turn quickly, I understand that we're going to be taking comments on the individual pieces of legislation that are proposed here today later in time, so I'm not going to address those now, or WIAC's positions on those now. However, I will state just briefly that WIAC does respectfully oppose those pieces of legislation because they will have the unintended impact of actually raising ratepayer rates, but I'll get to that later this afternoon. What I would like to do at this point in time is raise some policy considerations for this committee and 4 pieces of legislation we believe that this committee should consider passing that will provide very meaningful ratepayer protections and increased oversight over Rocky Mountain Power. The first piece of proposed legislation that WIAC supports and requests that this committee consider is legislation that will require the Public Service Commission to hold a fully litigated proceeding over Rocky Mountain Power's Integrated Resource Plan. Currently, Rocky Mountain Power's IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, is not subject to a litigated proceeding in Wyoming. Rather, the IRP is submitted to the Commission for acceptance, not approval. And the Commission merely solicits comments from interested parties on the IRP. There is no discovery process, there's no formal testimony from experts or trial on the merits of the IRP. Importantly, the IRP is the source material of Rocky Mountain Power's resource investment, and it is intended to produce the least cost, least risk resource plan. That is why WIAC believes it is critically important that it is fully vetted at the Public Service Commission. Other states, such as Utah and Oregon, do fully vet and approve the IRP when it is submitted to their public service commissions, giving those states a greater say in the direction of Rocky Mountain Power's resource investments. WIAC supports legislation that at a minimum would require the IRP to be subject to a fully litigated proceeding with commission approval of the IRP. And if no approval is provided, Rocky Mountain Power would be subject to higher rate recovery scrutiny for any investments that went forward without approval. This would put Wyoming on equal footing with other states that do fully approve or disapprove the IRP. This helps Wyoming ensure that the process of Rocky Mountain Power's planning and how to develop its resources is done in a way that is in the best interest of Wyoming and not just Oregon, for example. It also eliminates a key disadvantage that Wyoming has to Oregon under current law. The second piece of
Ms.
legislation.
Brigham,
Yes.
if I may. So you mentioned Utah and Oregon. What other states have an approval process for an IRP?
I believe that is the scope of it. Idaho may, but I'm not certain of that at this precise moment.
Okay, and just if if we were to look at guidance on what our law might look like when looking at Utah and Oregon, do you know enough about the IRP approval process in each state that you could tell me which state I should look at? Or does it matter?
I think what we want to do is take a look at both, not just the statutes, but the regulatory rules in both states and use those as a model to put something together.
Okay. Thank you. Please go ahead.
The second piece of legislation that WIAC requests this committee consider is codifying the 70-30 sharing band and the energy cost adjustment mechanism proceeding. I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what that is. It's been talked about a little today. In the general rate case, Rocky Mountain Power sets its base net power cost. That's what's going on in the rate case and the subject of the 97% portion of that case. Those rates are set and are only change at the next general rate case, which could be 5 years down the line, could be 2 years down the line, but those are the base net power costs that are in rates. The ECAM, the Energy Cost Adjustment Mechanism proceeding, occurs every year. And that's the time in which Rocky Mountain Power goes back to the commission and says, our actual net power costs were typically X amount of dollars over what are already included in base rates. The delta between those two is subject to this sharing band. It's a 70-30, right now it's an 80-20 sharing band, where Rocky Mountain Power is only allowed to recover 80% of that delta. It used to be a 70-30 sharing band. That was changed in the last rate case. That sharing band is very important. It incentivizes Rocky Mountain Power to keep those net power costs as low as possible to reduce its exposure to lack of recovery. Rocky Mountain Power has requested in this current rate case to eliminate that sharing band entirely. So all of power costs would just flow through directly to ratepayers, and Rocky Mountain Power would have no meaningful incentive to keep those power costs down. So the piece of legislation that we would request this committee consider is codifying into law the 70-30 sharing band for the ECAM.
Ms. Bergman, what in the last rate case led to the result of the 80-20 split to depart from the 70-30?
In the last rate case, Rocky Mountain Power requested the shift in the ECAM sharing band and argued that go back in time here. I believe it argued that it did not provide the incentive that it should, and there was the adjustment from 70-30 to 80-20 since then. And we've seen net power costs explode since then. So I'd have to go back into their testimony. The rate case was held in 2019 to 2020, so it's been a little while.
And so now we would put in statute the 70-30 sharing. Where did the 80-20 initially come from?
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head whether their filed case in the 2020 rate case was to eliminate it entirely or just to incrementally shift to the 80-20, but it was their proposal to move away from the 70-30 sharing band. And
I'm sorry, yeah, I meant the 70-30. Where did it originate from?
It's been around for as long as I've been doing this, over 10 years, and it's part of a very important compromise to keep Rocky Mountain Power incented to reduce its power costs. It all results from a general rate case. I couldn't tell you which one off the top of my head, though. It was the original source one, though.
Okay.
So that is the second piece of legislation that WIAC would request this committee consider. That would provide very meaningful ratepayer savings if that were codified into law. The third piece of legislation that WIAC supports the committee considering is requiring a competitive solicitation process for all major resource acquisitions. The least cost, least risk plan that comes from the IRP is subject to a competitive solicitation process in Utah and in Oregon. As a general matter, in those states, Rocky Mountain Power's request for proposals must be submitted to the commission, and the RFP process itself is subject to an independent evaluator's review and report. WIAC has over the years sought access to the confidential independent evaluator reports for use in Wyoming proceedings, but we're not able to access them. They're confidential and they cannot be shared fully with us. Some of the information is public, but not all of it. WIAC recommends that we support legislation that would require Rocky Mountain Power to obtain approval of an RFP in Wyoming and also subject the RFP process to a Wyoming independent evaluator. The fourth piece of legislation.
Hey, Ms. Brigham, can I jump back to the ECAM real quick?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman.
And I mean, yeah.
You get to do whatever you want.
Oh, I do? Well. I guess I should know this, but I don't know the general timing of the current rate case. So would it be feasible in any way for if we were to move a bill forward, we wouldn't have that into effect until March. Would it be, we wouldn't be able to impact the current case though? Because I'm guessing their decision will come out before March.
Unless we have a special session.
Right, the current, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The current timeline for the existing rate case is that the hearing is going to be held at the end of October and early November, and Rocky Mountain Power has requested rates to go into effect effective January 1st of 2024. So by that time, the new rates will be in effect.
Special session.
Yeah, sounds like a special session, huh? So and this isn't just true for the ECAM, but it's true for all of your proposals. We're not gonna be, without, short of a special session, we're not gonna be able to impact the current rate case, just future rate cases.
It's that, Mr. Chairman, that timing sounds correct.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
But am I not right in thinking if we were to pass something at the budget session, say have it in effect 1st of April or something like that, you could then have a very rapid process at PSC that readjusted those rates back?
Ms. Brigham, would you agree with that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, it's an interesting question. And I hate to say this, I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but if it could require Rocky Mountain Power to come back in to adjust rates if legislation were passed after the close of this rate case. However, my understanding is that Rocky Mountain Power does intend on filing another rate case in somewhat soon in order to recover the capital costs of the Gateway South projects that Mr. Hogovine was talking about earlier, Ms. Joelle Stewart were talking about earlier. So it is not unthinkable that another rate case will be expected in relative short order after this one concludes.
Okay. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The fourth piece of legislation that WIAC requests this committee consider would be to exempt third-party generation from commission regulation for direct sales to consumer. I do want to first differentiate between third-party generation and self-generation. This came up a little earlier. Representative Wiley, you had questions about third-party generation. Mr. Hogovine spoke in the context of self-generation, and that's when a customer owns the generation behind what's called behind the meter, and they own and operate the plant itself. That's different from third-party generation, where an independent power producer whose expertise is generation and running a plant, operating plant, comes in and is allowed to build that third-party generation and sell power directly to the consumer. And the distinction is important. Self-generation is permitted, third-party generation is generally not. And why it's important to open that up to consumers is that, for example, with a large industrial customer, their expertise is not running a power generator. Their expertise is not in maintaining that facility. Their expertise is, for example, in mining. It's just better sometimes when the third-party generator is owned and operated by somebody who specializes in that. And so I just want to make sure that we're talking about third-party generation here, which is currently not permitted, versus self-generation, which is currently permitted. And WIAC would support legislation that would allow for third-party generators to come in and supply these large customers from behind the meter. So those are the four pieces of legislation that WIAC is proposing today. I'm happy to answer any questions on those proposals or any questions on the rate case and ECAM proceedings at your pleasure. Thank you.
And I think this will come out in you'll testify later to this, but we do have your handout, and it's safe to say that WIAC opposes all of the legislation with the exception of one draft, which is 24 LSO 0229, and that's why you're talking to us about alternative legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, that is correct. WIAC does oppose all of the proposed pieces of legislation, with the exception of the statute requiring a study into decommissioning and costs. We take no position on that one, but the other 4 pieces of legislation, we have very real concerns that they will actually have the unintended result of actually raising rates for consumers. And that is something we're very concerned about with those 4 pieces of legislation. I'm happy to talk about that more when the time comes.
Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, 2 questions. One, with regard to your first proposal, you're talking about fully litigated proceedings.
Senator Scott, can you?
The litigation is very expensive. Public really can't engage in it. What's the cost of litigation likely to do in one of this? Is it going to mean that then residential customers are essentially cut out of the benefit of that? I'm concerned about that.
Ms. Briggerman?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Senator Scott. WIAC will fully participate in those proceedings, and we bring to the table a huge array of experts that do this type of analysis all the time. And the Office of Consumer Advocate is typically, at the table too, as well in these proceedings. I don't want to speak for Mr. Ornelas at all, but I would fully expect WIAC to be at the table at these proceedings, going through and fully vetting the IRP, and also the Office of Consumer Advocate to the extent it sees the need to be in the proceeding as well.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott?
Second question. I had earlier asked Rocky Mountain Power about the possibilities of a full deregulation, and they certainly sounded to me like they're very much opposed to it. And I thought they had some good points in what had happened elsewhere with when you get a sudden spike in the power costs. We managed to deregulate 40 years ago now, 30 years ago, natural gas retail within this state. And it's been fairly successful. It brought down the price spike we were having then. Would it be possible to do a more general deregulation that did not allow for recovery of sudden price spikes? In other words, the companies bid on the basis of what they were actually going to charge, and weren't allowed to recover if they hit a spike in their costs. Is that a possibility we ought to be considering?
Ms. Briggerman?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, I'll start with this comment. We represent not only the Wyoming industrial and energy consumers, but also an organization called the Montana Large Consumers. It's the exact same type of organization, but takes service in the state of Montana, primarily from Northwestern Energy. In Montana, they did deregulate, and then they re-regulated. Some of our customers within the Montana Large Customer Group decide to go back into the re-regulated construct. Some of our customers found it beneficial to stay in an unregulated state, and they take their own transmission service, they purchase their own power. It really depends on the customers you ask. Utilities tend to universally, they do not like a fully unregulated construct, but we do have large customers that have had an overall good experience with it. It's very complicated. I will agree with Mr. Hogeveen on this. It is very complicated. One of the things that WIAC looking into right now, and a lot of large industrial consumer coalitions are doing this throughout the West, is expanding the organized markets so that the the states in the West can more fully participate in organized markets as a way of keeping costs down. But going to a fully unregulated construct is incredibly complicated, and there is a lot of risk to it. So I think I would probably leave it at that.
Senator Case? Mr. Co-Chairman?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Boogerman, welcome and good to see you. I'd kind of like to pursue some of your thoughts. I think that Representative Knapp talked about the hamster wheel and, you know, how it's maybe a continuous motion machine. And I'm going to your first proposed legislation, which would be to litigate the integrated resource plan filings. I have personally always been troubled by the fact that electric utility regulation in Wyoming is sort of like slow setting cement that takes years to set. But when you get to the point of like a rate case here, it's pretty much already dialed in, or the hamsters have got the wheel going. For example, there's the MSP at the top, multi-state protocol, how we divide up the assets. Then we come in and we have integrated resource filings, which, as you might recall, that I asked for them to receive more scrutiny with a letter to the commission, you know, and they are getting slightly more scrutiny, but they're not a litigated proceeding. No one challenges it, and everyone says the essence would be that, well, it doesn't really mean anything, except for it really does mean something, and for ratepayers. And then you have certificates that are issued for particular construction projects, certificates of convenience and necessity. And all that gets dialed in. And then I have been assured that that doesn't mean we have to approve the rates. That doesn't mean we have to approve the rates. But all of these steps lead you a long ways towards having to approve the rates in my mind. And is your first proposal kind of addressing my concern in that area? Would that be fair, or do you have a different characterization of it?
Ms. Brigman?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I couldn't agree with you more. It's a process. The process, from my perspective, starts with the IRP. The IRP leads to the least cost, least risk resource plan. From there, the utility, Rocky Mountain Power, will issue an RFP to find the resources that will fit into the plan proposed by the IRP. Again, the RFP process is not regulated in Wyoming. From there, they get to the CPCN process, where Rocky Mountain Power is, sorry, my apologies, is the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. That's the formal term for obtaining the authorization to move forward with a project. There's the CPCN process where Rocky Mountain Power has to get that order from the commission for the CPCN. And then there's the rate case, in which they recover all the rates associated with the project once it comes into service and is used and useful for ratepayers. From my perspective, the IRP process, again, it's the source material for all of this. The resource plan is created out of that, and unless you go into the modeling that Rocky Mountain Power uses to create the least cost, least risk resource plan, you cannot see the assumptions that are built into that plan. You cannot see how, for example, whether a natural gas plant is modeled as a 10-year resource or a 30-year resource in that plan. And so it really, that is the source material that leads the utility down the path, the slow march to ultimate rate recovery. And with each additional approval, unless there's pushback, the rate case is actually very hard to push back on the costs of a project.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a little bit of follow-up. And I couldn't agree with you. We agree with each other. And I think we heard it today in the company's discussion up front about how a lot of this stuff is already, it was proposed 5 years ago. It was proposed, and that's concerning. With respect to competitives, your number 3, and really it relates to the whole regulatory process. We've had folks complain to us about the amount of confidentiality that commission proceedings have and how stuff is often filed under protective order. And do we need for all those things? Because these are regulated public utilities. What is the source of a lot of things being under protective order? And the committee might recall, those of you who've been around a little bit, Mr. Ken Lay has come to us and talked about the confidentiality and over difficulty for outsiders to find out more information. Does that sort of relate to your competitive solicitation process, or is it kind of totally different?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Senator Case. It's related in some respects. There are some instances where confidentiality is extremely important. So I don't want to make an overarching statement that there's no useful purpose to labeling documents as confidential. What is important with respect to the RFP process is that interested parties in Wyoming who do sign non-disclosure agreements that subject them to rules on confidentiality, that they can view the confidential information that, for example, was allowed for Utah interested parties to look at in Utah. With respect to this is a very special circumstance with respect to these independent evaluator reports that look at these RFPs. That information, I think, is critically important to understanding the puts and takes into the RFP process, but because we cannot view that in Wyoming, but other parties in Utah, for example, can view that information, we're at a bit of a disadvantage in Wyoming to understanding how the RFP process was conducted in Utah. And it's a very special circumstance here. And the competitive solicitation process, we believe, should be imposed in Wyoming as well. So Wyoming can look at that process and have its say in that process, evaluate the projects that come out, and make sure that the least cost, least resource plan from the IRP is actually being implemented the best way.
Thank you very much for that. And with regard to the exempting of third-party generation, so what you're really talking about is an industrial facility that on their own property or right next to their own property, they work with another provider to provide exclusive power for them, and it comes in behind the fence, their side of the fence. That's what you're proposing. Is that correct? I may have another follow-up after that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, yes, that is the situation we're talking about here. We're talking about taking what large industrial, any customer can already do so long as they own it, but it just is owned and operated by somebody who does that, has the expertise in doing that.
Mr. Chairman, with respect to that proposal, do you also think that these companies should be able to jointly own facilities? Say there were 2 different companies. They both jointly wanted to contract with a third party to provide a plant for the exclusive use of both of them. Their fences might be a little bit apart, but they figure out how to connect them. Is that also proposed under your idea?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, right now we're just looking at a single facility that's a single generator that's providing all of its power to one customer, and it's not selling to anybody else on the system, whether behind the meter. Right now, it's just a one-for-one construct that we're looking at. Certainly opening it up a little farther than that makes it a little more complicated. But the key important thing for WIAC members at this point in time is that they be enabled to access a third-party provider as opposed to having to do it all themselves when that's not necessarily their area of expertise.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Briggerman.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sounds like you'll be back later.
Sounds like it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Kaysen, I'm just looking at number 1 of the proposed legislation from WIAC, and you operate in the states of Utah and Oregon, so you already operate under these requirements that an IRP be fully vetted by the Public Service Commission. I would assume you wouldn't have any pushback then in Wyoming if you're doing that in 2 other states already. Or whoever from Rocky Mountain Power would like to. Ms. Stewart.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, so we file our IRP in all 6 states. All 6 states have processes that review the IRP. California, a little less so, but we're very small in California. They all do acknowledgement versus Wyoming's acceptance. I mean, it's a robust process, and Wyoming has done a robust process on our IRPs as well in the past. It's the devil's in the detail on what are the requirements that would be required as part of that process.
Well, let's just say that Wyoming required that the PSC approve the IRP.
Well, you do
Like
want to be
Utah
clear.
and Oregon, what would be your position on legislation like that?
Thank you, Chairman. So no state actually approves an IRP. It's always acknowledgement of an IRP. So it's short of any kind of recognition of pre-approval. It is acknowledgement itself is a little bit of a heavier weight than merely accepting for filing. But we would not be opposed to Wyoming also having a process to formally acknowledge the IRP.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot for that, but appreciate it. Additional public comment? Any additional public comment? In the virtual world, we have the Honorable Patrick Sweeney.
Chairman Throne just raised her hand.
Oh, did you want to? Yeah.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay. Come forward then. I didn't see you behind the person in front of you there. These seats up here are more comfortable anyway. Welcome, Commissioner Throne.
Thank you, Chairman Olson, Chairman Case, members of the committee. I thought just to be timely, it might be worthwhile to respond to WIAC's comments on proposed legislation that's not in front of you. Because I could say great minds think alike, sort of. Because in our comments, we were going to suggest looking at different IRP processes and also considering some sort of review of all source procurement. That's kind of been on our list for a long time, and we were evaluating whether we needed statutory authority to do so. But in terms of the IRP process, and I could be wrong, and I would defer to Ms. Stewart, but my understanding is that Utah's process is a little more flexible, I guess I would say, than Oregon's. I would have to research Oregon's statutes. But certainly for the all-source RFP process, and I don't have it in front of me this second, but could certainly get it to you. I think Utah's model is something that we could consider. What we want to avoid in the IRP process is binding ourselves to the decisions. That's the difference between acknowledgement and approval. I think it's also worth noting that when we did fully litigate the Rocky Mountain IRP, as you will probably recall, we did that in 2019. We opened an investigation into the IRP, and because of the complexity of their modeling, we sought funding, I believe, from the governor's office, I wasn't chairman then, to be able to hire an expert. And it was a six-figure number. I can find the exact number, but it was definitely in the six-figure category. One thing we could also consider doing, and that I haven't proposed formally to my colleagues, is opening an investigation into whether the current IRP complies with our order in the 2019 IRP. And we have authority to do that now. We don't need additional statutory authority. But I think there could be some value to giving us more scrutiny over IRPs generally, but we need to be careful how we do it. And, recognize that Rocky Mountain Power is not the only company that files an IRP. They're filed by natural gas companies as well as the electric utilities. And I have often thought, or since I've been in this job, that looking more closely at the all-source RFPs would be important. We still have our authority under certificates of public convenience and necessity, but they've already gone through an all-source RFP process, and they come to us and say, this is what the all-source RFP process kicked out. And we review that, but we don't have a proceeding for the all-source RFP. So I'm not in total agreement with Ms. Briggerman, or with apologies, you, Senator Case, because I think we have the authority to do whatever we want in a rate case if the evidence does not support the rate proposal. And we will do that. And that brings me to one last point I want to make. I made a point of not listening to Rocky Mountain Power's presentation this morning or to any of your questions. I just want to gently remind you and all of your colleagues that the commission is an independent commission. We are independent of the legislature when we adjudicate cases. We are independent of the governor's office when we adjudicate cases, like any court should be. And even though we're an administrative body, we are functioning as a court in this situation. We are about to have a very intense, multi-day hearing. In fact, we have a different hearing tomorrow for Rocky Mountain Power. But starting on October 25th, we have, I think it's scheduled for 7 or 8 day evidentiary hearing with Rocky Mountain Power, of which Mr. Case, Senator Case, Chairman Case, is a party. And we will decide that case based on the record in front of us. And I, just to make a general comment about all the bills that have been proposed, it would be my suggestion, just generally speaking, that you proceed deliberately to avoid the risk of doing any harm to ratepayers. Our order in the Rocky Mountain Power rate case will be out by the end of December, because we have a legal obligation to get it out by the end of December. I do not believe personally that you could do anything to affect the pending rate application. I'm not an attorney anymore, but I did represent a lot of companies. And when they got their permits, they had their permits. And to change the rules after the game is generally not allowed under the law, just as a general principle. But I think my major concern is that you first do no harm, and also recognize that that Rocky Mountain Power is not the only utility in the state of Wyoming. So whatever you have to do, of course, applies to all of them. And that's just my only thought for the general picture. And I can save specific comments for the specific drafts later.
Chairman Throne, with respect to the ECAM sharing band, do you have any knowledge of the rate case that shifted it from the 70-30 to the 80-20? And if so, what was the impetus for that change?
So that was, Mr. Chairman, that was in the last rate case. And in that rate case, Rocky Mountain Power proposed eliminating the sharing band. Our order in that rate case was about 50 pages, 47 pages with single space paragraphs, just to give you a sense of what we're looking at. So at paragraph 79 and below in that order, we discussed the evidence that they presented. Rocky Mountain Power proposed eliminating the 70-30 sharing band. And we agreed, or two of us supported going to 80-20. The ECAM is non-traditional rate making. It's also worth noting that we put the band in place to balance the company and the customer interests. So it's something that can change. And again, Black Hills has a more complicated sharing band system, which depends on the source of the power. So for Cheyenne Light, it's 85-15 if it's a steam plant, 95% sharing band if it's PPAs, that's Cheyenne Light. Black Hills Power, well, 95% of costs above or below the first million, 90% of costs after the first million. So again, Rocky Mountain Power is not the only utility we regulate, although sometimes it certainly feels like it's the only utility we regulate.
Thank you. Senator Scott?
Oh, and could I go back to the sharing band for
Yes.
one instance? Sorry, Chairman Olson. Just wanted to explain that Commissioner Robinson did dissent from the 80-20, and he would have left it at 70-30. It's in the opinion.
Thank you. Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, question on public convenience and necessity. We're in a bit of an unusual circumstance in Wyoming. Not only are we consumers of power, but one of the major sources of bread and butter for the state is producing energy in various forms, Mr. Chairman. And if a company hypothetically were to come and want to do, say, a wind power project in Wyoming that was not designed to benefit Wyoming, was designed to entirely benefit some other state, do they need to get a certificate of public convenience and necessity? Are they hampered in their ability to do certain things, like build the necessary connecting lines and that sort of thing without one? How would that work?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, they would have to get a certificate of public convenience and necessity in Wyoming if they want to recover any portion of those costs in Wyoming, and they need it to proceed. We also have the non-CITUS certificate, public of convenience and necessity, which you passed in 2019, if I remember correctly, or maybe it was 2018. So in Wyoming, if a utility is building a facility outside of Wyoming that they expect to use as a system asset, and it meets certain financial thresholds, they also have to get a certificate of public convenience and necessity. But the CPCN does not make any determination with regard to cost allocation. So all the cost allocation to the ratepayers is determined in the rate case. And we have that caveat in any CPCN order that we issue.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Scott.
I'm concerned not about where they want to put part of the thing into Wyoming rates. I'm concerned about a situation where they wanted to build something in Wyoming that was not going to go into Wyoming rates. Could they proceed independent, not get a CPCN? And would that hamper their ability to construct the project?
Chairman Throne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Scott, they would still have to get a CPCN in Wyoming, even if it's not for Wyoming ratepayers. If they're a regulated utility, not if they're a merchant power, but if they're a regulated utility and they want to build something in Wyoming, they have to get a CPCN in Wyoming.
Co-Chairman Case.
Yeah, not a question for the commission, but Senator Scott, I think you touched on an issue about whether whether an entity could use eminent domain or not.
Yeah.
So in Wyoming, that's been an issue with respect to third-party generation of, that's not utility power, and whether these merchant plants can use eminent domain to connect where they need to connect or not. The Agricultural Committee is looking at that issue right now. There was a bill last time. It was vetoed by the governor, I believe. So whether that comes back or not, but it's kind of unrelated to this. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Throne.
Thank you. My attorney was whispering in my ear. I think I might have overstated a little bit, Senator Scott. If the utility wants to recover any of the costs of whatever they're building in Wyoming, then they have to get a CPCN.
And Mr. Chairman, I was concerned about circumstance where they did not want to do that.
Mr. Chairman, with regard to Rocky Mountain Power, I mean, they, to my knowledge, well, I don't know any utility who's attempted to do that because they tend to label everything as a system asset. Certainly with Black Hills, we have a wind farm here where I believe most of the subscribers are from South Dakota, but some of them are from Wyoming.
All right, additional questions for the Public Service Commission? All right. Thank you, Chairman Throne. I'm going to jump to the virtual world. We do have Pat Sweeney. Welcome, Pat. Welcome, Honorable Pat Sweeney.
Good morning. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to thank Senator Case for his great explanation. I also wanted to mention for newer committee members, Rocky Mountain Power, who you had before you and is still in the room from what I can tell, had their AAA best squad, and hats off to President and CEO for making the trip. So they are definitely paying attention to what you're saying and taking it all in stride as they do. So one question I guess I had, which I think Senator Case and Senator Scott should be aware of. But if you did a special session for those pieces of legislation suggested, and would also caution us on maybe heading that way, but doesn't the Administrative Procedures Act still apply to the rulemaking with those pieces of legislation, which further complicates and draws any action that you would take in this particular case? But with that, thank you for allowing me to testify and appreciate the good work.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Any questions for Mr. Sweeney? No?
Looking tan and fit.
You're looking good, Mr. Sweeney, according to Co-Chairman Case. Keep up the good work. All right, additional public comment.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Gary Brown, citizen of Cheyenne, Wyoming. Just a citizen here. I'm not an expert, but I did do some research and I wanted to bring that to you. I know that Rocky Mountain Power and other utility companies are operating with their hands tied behind their back. And I understand that that's a hard thing for them to do, and that's being done by the federal government. But I want to shift gears and I want to look at things in a little different way here. And Representative Harrison had touched on it before, that our coal-fired plants are a most efficient way and most economical way of producing energy. So the research that I did was going in and looking at what people are calling a climate crisis. We supposedly have a climate crisis. And what I found using government numbers, that's not true, folks. It's just not. So the Department of Consumer Affairs report in 2021, it's the most recent numbers that I could find, said that Wyoming is the highest producing state of CO2. And it's, they do a per capita figure on this, and that's 100,000 people is their per capita number. It said we can't use a single person because that's negligible, and we couldn't even calculate it at that. So looking at that, 100,000 people in Wyoming per capita, we produce 68.55 metric ton of CO2. So if we look at that number and we take it with the population of Wyoming, which is 578,000, we multiply 5.78 by 68.55, and we come up with 396 metric tons of CO2. Now, I'm a person that was born with the baby boomers, so what I want to do is I want to convert this to pounds and work from there. So 2,204 pounds per metric ton. So if we take that and convert what we just did, we have 872,784 pounds of CO2 produced by the state of Wyoming per year. So we take that number and divide it by 68, or excuse me, let me go back here. I believe that's 48, yes. So the USDA and Arbor Day Foundation say that a single tree uses 48 pounds of CO2. So we take that number and divide it by 48, and we find out we need 18,138 trees to utilize the CO2 that Wyoming puts out in a year. Now, Wyoming has between 100 and 200 trees per acre. So if we take the average of that, 150 trees per acre, and take 18,183 trees, divide that by 150, we find we need 122 acres of trees. 122 acres is all we need of trees to utilize the CO2. But I did some more research, and USDA says that we have 9.8 million acres of trees in Wyoming. So if we look at that, 150 times 9.8 billion, we find out we have 1.47 billion trees in the state of Wyoming. And if we work those numbers, we find out that we have the capability of using 70.56 billion pounds of CO2 in a year. We're ignoring these facts. When we talk about a climate crisis, we're ignoring the facts. We want to take the numbers of CO2 that the government tells us we produce and stop there and no longer do anything else. Rocky Mountain Power could save a lot of money not having to do the carbon collective devices. And our trees, we have trees that are dying from beetle kill because they're not healthy enough to fight off the larvae. We've always had beetles. I grew up in Colorado and Wyoming. I've never seen beetle kill until we started reducing carbon dioxide. And when we started reducing it, the trees are dying because of it. Those are facts.
Thank you, Mr. Brown, for your comments and your time. Do you have any questions, committee? No? Mr. Acey? Yes, please.
My name is Bruce Acey. I appear here before you today on behalf of MDU Resources in Bismarck, North Dakota, to address some of what you have discussed this morning. I do need to thank you very much for the discussion that you had in presenting utility regulation and using a time-warmed formula for coming up with rates. And I think it's well to go over that and so everybody can have the background to know how rates are discussed. So the committees understand Montana Dakota Utilities Company is a subsidiary of MDU Resources, and we serve electric and natural gas customers in northern Wyoming. But we also have customers in Montana, North and South Dakota, and Minnesota, and have other utilities companies that extend from Minnesota to Oregon and Washington. So 8 states, and 4 of which have electric operations. In all that's been said, and I certainly want to emphasize what Chairman Throne indicated, and that is that there are other utilities in the state. And if we focus in legislating to address one particular utility, the concern that Montana Dakota has is that it might have a negative impact on other utilities such as Montana Dakota and our customers in northern Wyoming. It is difficult in a multi-state situation such as confronts Rocky Mountain to address all the needs of all regulatory bodies and all legislators. You know, Minnesota And the legislators in Minnesota are a lot different than they are in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. And to try to satisfy all of the different concerns is a challenge. But we do appreciate what this legislature does and what you're attempting to do with the legislation that you have in front of you. One aspect of regulation that Senator Case failed to provide to you is the fundamental concept of it all depends on whose ox is being gored. Because everybody has an interest that could be benefited or hurt. And so for a public service commission or a regulatory body or a legislature to try to address all of the needs of all of your constituency or all consumers is very difficult. We emphasize that there is an existing body of regulation in the statute and in the regulation that is very broad and addresses a lot of issues that you might be addressing in some of the legislation that you're proposing today. We certainly recommend that you give the Public Service Commission a chance to interpret its statutory authority as well as the regulations to ensure that consumers are being protected, whether it's large consumers or small consumers. We believe that all interests have to be addressed. In regard to certain of the comments that have been made today, Montana Dakota has generally been somewhat resistant to deregulatory initiatives. We do believe that the RFP process is appropriate as it does allow for protest and review. And because of that, we are recommending that the commission, just as the PSC has advocated today and cautioned, that you do take a careful and deliberate approach with respect to the legislation that you propose. And with that, I do appreciate your time and particularly for allowing the public to address this very important concept. Thank you.
Questions for Mr. AC? Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I understand governed by a multi-state protocol and allocation.
Mr. AC.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott. So with respect to the electrical service that Montana Dakota provides, it is in northern Wyoming and Sheridan, Buffalo, in that area. We do provide electrical service not only in that area, but also in Montana, North and South Dakota. And not only do we have to apportion the costs as it relates to electrical service, but we also have that issue as it relates to natural gas and apportioning the service. Essentially, Wyoming is about 10% of our revenues. And so we don't have the same construct that they do with respect to Rocky Mountain, but we do have an allocation that has generally been successful that we've used over the years as we've allocated costs between the various jurisdictions.
So you're operating without a formal protocol.
Well, it's not the same formal protocol, but there is coordination between the jurisdictions.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, hold on there, Representative Ottman. Are you done, Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I'm just trying to figure out if we do some legislation that relates to multi-state protocols, do we have to worry about we're catching MDU and Black Hills, or are we not? Or they under different circumstances?
Mr. AC.
Senator Scott, our circumstances are different, but certainly we would watch very carefully any legislation that's going to impact our relationship between the other jurisdictions and the regulatory bodies there, because it is sensitive and every state wants to protect their constituency.
Representative Ottman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The conversation is so important and so good. I was trying to get Senator Scott to have his microphone. Thank you.
It's an ongoing chore of
Yeah.
mine to keep him
Yes.
on task, and I'm sorry I failed that time. Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ms. Tracy, thanks for being here. Just as a 30,000-foot question, are we seeing the same pressures up in the territories you expounded on that we're seeing throughout the West? I'm assuming that many of the things that we talked about this morning, the pressures, the price escalation, is Mondac experiencing the same things? Is this a nationwide thing that people are just looking at power increases?
Ms. Tracy.
Chairman, Senator. So yes, it is very much a national issue that all utilities are facing and consumers everywhere. I mean, recently you read in the papers where some of our leadership in industry are indicating that the needs for electricity are going to increase substantially. And it was mentioned, particularly with the growth in storage and that type of thing, that we're going to have issues as we try to meet this need in the future. And we need to not only be concerned with what's immediately in front of us, but also look at the needs for the future. We don't want to be in a position where we become, we have a situation where electricity is going to be in short supply because of the time constraints we have with respect to meeting it. But just to give you an understanding, an issue in trying to utilize natural gas as a, energy source for electricity. This past year, we saw in Western Wyoming, natural gas go from $8 to $12 to $50 in one month, and then drop down. An emergency situation that cost our customers, hundreds and thousands of millions of dollars. And it was focused in the West because the East was appreciating utilizing $4 natural gas. So it is not only a national, but also a regional issue, and it's very difficult to address.
Additional questions, committee? Thank you, Ms. Tracy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Additional public comment on, any additional public comment in the virtual world? No? Any additional public comment in the room? Going once, going twice. All right, I will close public comment. And yeah, committee, looking at the agenda with the legislation, even if we averaged a conservative 20 minutes per bill and the resolution, we're looking at least 2 more hours worth of work. So we definitely have an afternoon's worth of work. So why don't we break for lunch and then come back and work through these bills?
And Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I think it'd be likely at the end of the day, we would have a general discussion and possibly have different or more bill drafts for next meeting. So,
Yep, I think
and
that's
I
exactly
believe
right.
there might be an issue unrelated to electricity where the clerks are going to come and give us an update on something where they're looking for a bill draft at our next meeting. Very simple one, but I'm sorry, they can't figure out a way to get it in the queue.
All right.
Okay.
Sounds good.
I suggest they could write us a letter, but I don't know what's going to happen.
If they'd like to come, they can come.
I never turn down the clerks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
They are, in my profession, they're the gatekeepers, so they're pretty important. How about an hour lunch? Let's do an hour. Be back 1:10, 1 o'clock.